Good morning and welcome to the 27th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and staff present that social distancing measures are in place in committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. In addition, a face covering must be worn when moving around, exiting and entering the committee room, although they can be removed once you are seated at the table in the committee room. Can I also remind all those present to turn any mobile devices to silent so that they do not disturb the committee's work. We have received apologies from Willie Coffey MSP and Neil Bibby MSP, and can I welcome John Mason and Joanne Lamont, who are attending in their places. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. Do any members object to taking items 3 and 4 in private? And if Alec Neil MSP, who is joining us remotely, objects, please raise your hand. That is agreed. Agenda item 2 is post-legislative scrutiny, the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016. At our meeting today, the committee will be taking evidence from the Lobbying Registrar and then from the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans. Can I welcome our first panel of witnesses who are attending in person? Billy McLaren, Lobbying Registrar, and James Drummond, Assistant Registrar, both from the Lobbying Registrar team in the Scottish Parliament. I understand that both Billy McLaren and James Drummond wish to make some opening statements. So can I invite Billy McLaren to kick off for us?
Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. Thank you. Just a few words from James and I to start off today's session. You will know that the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016 was a Scottish Government bill which all political parties passed in March 2016, which was late in their session 4. Royal assent followed in April 2016, and from that point, responsibility for the development and implementation then passed to the Parliament to establish this new lobbying register. So James and I are one half of a 4-person team in the Parliament that now administers the lobbying register. And as an initiative that's been placed in the care of the Parliament, we've been very keen to make sure we work with all stakeholders with an interest. We're very pleased that the Act contained a review at this point, allowing everyone to take stock, look practically at what's worked and what has perhaps not, and to see where consensus can be found in the future course for the lobbying register.
James Drummond.
Good morning, everyone. I'd also like to thank the committee for inviting us along to give evidence today. And I hope that we can share with you our experience of administrating the register over the last 2.5 years. And just to touch further on what Billy has said, although the operation of the register only began in March 2018, our work began well in advance of that commencement date, just to promote the Act, and we'll be happy to expand further on that if you wish this morning on that work. But really what we're here today to do is help the committee's work in terms of undertaking the review. On the back of the written submissions you've received and the evidence heard a fortnight ago, we hope that the information we provide you will help the committee learn more about the work that we do and how the lobbying register system works. If there's anything that's not covered in today's session or you seek further information on, we'll be happy to do what we can to provide you with this via any further sessions or through communication with the clerks. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. You'll have seen from the evidence taken by the committee so far that we have split our work and evidence on this into 3 themes, the 3 themes being the impact and operation of the Act to date, the second being the status quo or legislative reform, and the third being non-legislative improvements. We are going to try and cover these 3 areas, perhaps not as in a structured way as perhaps we would like, but we will try and cover those three areas. And before I hand over to Colin Beattie to ask some specific questions about the impact and the operation of the Act, can I ask you both just to give a general reflection on whether you think the piece of legislation works in its current form, whether it has sufficient scope, what you feel in terms of its general operation, and any reflections on that. I'll kick off with Billy McLaren.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I mean, it's still relatively early in the life of any lobbying register. We're 2 years plus into the system being set up, and of course returns start to flow in after we've got the system set up and running. Most organisations themselves have been through, about 70% of the organisations have been through what we call 5-6 month statutory periods, so it's still a learning process, I think. In terms of the Act, I mean, when it was looked at, I think we were looking at a new form of transparency. There was no transparency on any form of lobbying of this nature. At the time, I mean, this is predating the register team which is here before you, The Scottish Government and the Standards Committee had looked at face-to-face lobbying being the most effective way to lobby, and therefore probably initially the most instructive and worthwhile to record. And again, Section 50 of the Act did schedule this review for 2 years on. So in some respects, nothing's really changed since that initial question. You'll always get more transparency by recording more lobbying interactions, but where does that question of balance fit now? I think quite importantly, what we have had, even though it's a relatively short period, is we do have nearly 11,000 or over 11,000 substantive returns now published on face-to-face lobbying activity. So for the first time, I think we are seeing a picture developing of what lobbying looks like for the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government in that period. I mean, these thousands of returns do help us to look in more detail about who's submitting, who's lobbying, etc. So we've got that advantage too as we reach the review. And also, I think there's probably been, by any account, more registrants and more returns submitted than we expected. That's, I think, to me, gives some evidence that there's a willingness to comply, and in this particular type of communication. And I think it's worth saying, just although some people will say that the scope of face-to-face lobbying is quite narrow, we are talking about covering a whole range of different people, from big, medium-sized businesses, third sector charities, representative bodies and others, consultants and public relations firms, obviously. And this was all new to them, so it's been a big challenge in the last 2.5 years for everybody. So I think we've come our way.
James Drummond?
Yeah, in terms of what you're saying about the impact, I mean, I think our focus really so far has been on administration and support of the users since the register commenced. So we've not had a full evaluation of that yet. And I think, again, we're here today. We appreciate the review as maybe a stepping stone, and probably welcome an impact assessment at some point on the operation of the register, but it's not something that we've done ourselves so far.
Go back to what you said, Billy McLaren, about you analysed the data. So when you analyse the data, what's the key things you think you've learned from analysing that data that we didn't know before that we know now?
Well, I mean, we haven't done a deep impact assessment, but we have, and it's not a statutory requirement, we felt it was a good idea to do an annual report each year. So we obviously left a little bit of time, so it wasn't quite a year, it was 18 months for the first report, and quite recently we've just published and given the committee a copy of our most recent report. I think what that's telling us is, and there's not been a great deal of change between 2019 and 2020 reports in terms of the types of organisations coming forward. There's always been a few more, but I don't think we've seen a great change in the pattern of who's engaged in regulated lobbying. I think that data is useful. For us, it's useful because it allows us to put out a set of data which is factual. I mean, it's very important to us as parliamentary officials not to be engaged in the sort of the spin of what, top 10 tables and so forth. We want to make sure that we provide factual data that people can make their own assumptions from. So that's really, if you like, in terms of impact assessment, that's the two.
So you've done a data analysis, but not really a deep review about what it might mean.
No.
Are you aware of that data analysis being used to do a review about what it might mean by government, or are you not aware of any such review that's taken place?
No, we've seen various pieces of work that have been done, but there's not been an awful lot I can see externally, and certainly I'm not aware of any deep analysis of what data we've got there so far.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Peter. I wonder if the Registrar has any thoughts on evidence that we've had from some of the respondents about the administrative burden on lobbying organisations arising from this Act.
Yeah, I think largely they're responding to submitting information through information returns, which, as I mentioned, is 11,000 plus of those substantive information returns. Our presumption is always to publish information returns. In fact, we do publish more than 2/3 within 7 days. But I think we're in a learning process, as I mentioned earlier. It's a learning process for those who are submitting returns. It's been a learning process for our team as well in terms of reviewing them and providing assistance on the parliamentary guidance that is designed to help them. So again, we're fairly early in. I think we do think that we can improve the way in which some people see as drudgery, for example, in information returns. and we've already taken some steps on that front. There's without getting too boringly technical, there's two main boxes in the return, which I think is the main focus of people, saying that it can be quite a drudgerous thing. The description of the meeting box is really just a very basic box to say what you had, a meeting, a discussion, etc. I think people find it a bit monotonous and a bit time-consuming to put in ministerial titles and put in the constituency title for members, which we kind of need for data integrity reasons. We do that now. We just don't, you know, it became a bit, you could tell people were getting frustrated with that.
Is there any way to reduce the administrative burden?
Yes, and I think automating that particular box is something we're already looking at. I think that is a frustration. I think people getting sent back returns for that purpose alone is a frustration. Some
organisations suggested that perhaps the burden should be turned around and put back on the regulated individuals, you know, the MSPs, ministers and so on. Have you had any lobbying yourself or pressure for that?
No. I mean, one thing I would say, we're talking about publishing MSP's diaries and ministers' diaries, etc. I mean, one thing, this came up early on in the debate before we came into being, but I mean, one thing about publishing diaries is that it doesn't actually say what the lobbying was. It would just give you an indication of what meeting took place, and I think that's the difference between a lobbying register and publishing a piece of information which is a factual thing about who met who.
One of the things that's been talked about is this bulk upload feature.
Yeah.
Can you give a bit more information on that?
Well, we have a bulk upload feature which we introduced to help us. It relates to another frustration that people have, and indeed it's one we raised ourselves in our annual report with a hope that the committee would look at it when the time came for the review about multiple returns. The bulk upload feature we've got is very basic. It just means you can save all the returns and then click one button by ticking the boxes and submit it. The bulk upload that some people are talking about is an Excel spreadsheet. It's actually quite a technical and complex thing to do in terms of relating to two. I mean, we don't rule it out, and we have looked at it. But just so the committee is aware, I mean, our budget is very small in IT terms. We've got £10,000 a year to spend on development costs, for example, and you know that function alone would more than surpass that. We don't rule it out, and if the committee is recommending more investment in the IT, we certainly don't have a problem with that, as you'd imagine. But we have to work within the pocket with which we've got.
Just one last question. Can you reassure us that you're actually working with the various organisations that are doing the lobbying with a view to improving the system and developing how it's operating?
I mean, James might cover this later on, but I mean, our approach has always been inclusive. I think we couldn't have made this work if we hadn't. We continually still meet, unfortunately not at the moment, face-to-face, but we continually still meet with organisations to think about ways to improve things. And I would reassure them that we have things in the pipeline with our small budget that can help to change those things. And one of the things is this automation of parts of the information return. We don't actually ask for a huge amount of information in the information return. It's only the headings that are listed in the Act, so it's kind of basic things. Where we can find ways to remove that, we're going to try and find ways to remove that. And one thing we have identified is this automation of the description box as a way forward. We would be coming to registrants anyway to say this is what we have in mind, and we see that as a continual process. I mean, to turn it the other way, it causes us more work to check and deal with compliance issues. And we'd like to reduce that part of our work so we can spend more time on the positive things like getting returns through.
Yes,
there
of
as
course.
well.
James,
Yeah, so just, and again, it kind of refers to the IT equipment, the system and the technological solutions. I think in the previous session we heard about and again you might ask us about apps for the lobbying register. I mean, the system as it is now is scalable. I mean, it's something that you can use on any device, and we hear about organisations who will use it on their laptop or on their mobile phone. So again, budget-wise, creating an app is not something that we could do now, but the system can be used via mobile phone. It's there, it's on the phones just now. And if I turn to what you were saying about what we do with the organisations in terms of how we approach and provide them guidance, I mean, it is something that we've done from day one to ensure that any and all registrants have the necessary information to aid them in understanding and compliance with the Act and what it is that they submit. We spent a lot of time visiting organisations and taking part in round tables, hearing from all the various sectors about what their concerns were. And a lot of that work that we did actually help us in conjunction with our own work in interpreting the Act, how we would provide supplementary documentation for common scenarios, FAQs, just to provide a suite of information so that anybody that was using the register had these documents in hand to be able to, right, okay, I have something to submit, how do I submit it, what is the type of things that we're looking for. So we've done all that, and again, in terms of how we've approached it, we even had the IT system up and running in 2017, 4 months before the Act was commenced. This allowed organisations to get a feel for the system and give them the chance to have submit real examples of what was soon going to become regulated lobbying after the 12th of March. And even post-commencement, we've done that. There's been more of the same. Assisting the stakeholders really is the foundation of all that we do. We're always in hand to provide them advice. Everything's underpinned by what you might hear later on today about the 5 key steps to what regulated lobbying is and all the guidance that we have for them.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Graham Simpson in a moment. You mentioned that you didn't have the capacity to build an app. Is that because you don't have the budget, or you don't think it's required, or what's the reason behind that?
Well, I wasn't there right at the very start. I mean, I don't know if the app was ever discovered, was ever considered. But really, the main thing was about getting the actual register up and running. Apps were mentioned, but again, it's something I think we've considered would be further down the line.
Yep.
I've no idea how much it would cost to develop apps.
Yep. In terms of functionality of the platform, how would you rate it?
We think there's improvements to be made, and that's what we've been discussing. We've got a budget to do so many improvements. We've also got an obligation to do some upgrades in terms of how the website looks. I mean, on the website, it's 3 years old. It's amazing how quickly technology moves on. You get page rendering, beta, websites, etc. And sometimes they just look a bit old after a few years. And I think ours is in need of a refresh, that's for sure. And I think we need to improve the search facilities, and that's came through in some of the evidence that you've heard. And we're fully aware of that. I mean, the information is there, and it's been about building that information up over the last few years. And it needs to be findable, and it needs to be usable.
Yep.
There is a function within the, and nobody mentioned in the previous session, but there is a function within the register which is very important. It's got a CSV file. And just very briefly, which is a complete download of every information return. And that's kind of the research tool that most people use when they look at, doing a bit deeper research into what's happening. So that's there.
Graham has got some specific questions on accessibility, but just focusing on the actual platform itself for a second. Would you have you done an analysis of what you ideally would like the platform to look like and operate like, and then went away and done a cost on it, or does that have to be done by government, and that you don't have the scope to do that?
No, I mean, the budget's ours, and the choices are ours, and we do that within the budget that we've got. So we sit.
So have you went and said, okay, this is what we want, ideal scenario, this is what we can live with?
Yes.
And X would be the cost of it. Have you done that?
We do a prioritisation process every year. So at the start of the year, we roll over what we couldn't do, and then we have a look at what stakeholders have said, and
So as part of that work, for the ideal of what you'd like to do, what's the cost?
We wouldn't be able to do that without knowing exactly what our IT contractors would cost that. But we've got a pretty good idea from the developments we've made over the years about how much an individual item of expenditure costs. And you're usually looking at, £2,000, £3,000, £4,000 for a fairly minor change to be made. That's a fairly reasonable price in today's market, I think. Some of the bigger costs, like an app, we'd be happy to go and cost. We just haven't had the window to do it.
No, sorry, I was meaning, Mr. McLaren, you were saying that you have done the work in terms of what you'd ideally like to do, and went and got the scoping and a costings done. What did that come back and say?
Well, we managed to spend up to 9,999 every year. We use the budget to its full capacity, and of course, then the budget for next year, we start early planning that and speak to our IT contractors and see what we can afford. we can.
No, sorry, what I'm meaning is, what I mean is not within what you can afford, was in that work, in an ideal scenario, this is what we'd like to happen and this is what it would cost. Have you
Yes.
done that work?
No, we haven't done it to that extent,
Okay.
no.
Okay, is that something you'd like to do?
Yes.
Okay.
Just got to expand on what we actually do just now. So we do have an IT enhancement document that is with our external contractors. And again, that sets out our priorities of what it is we would like to do in terms of these adjustments and improvements to the system. So it's currently with IT contractors. We're still awaiting word back in terms of what it would cost for each of these.
Right.
So we'll then be able to decide how we spend that money before the end of this financial year.
And when are you expecting to get that back?
I mean, we need the prices back, but we said, here's what we would want to spend, here's what we'd like to do this year, and what can we get for 10,000 essentially. So we'll make choices in that, and then that will be what we've spent for this year. We've already got, clearly we're on a contingency funding basis, and if we could use the contingency for what we've just been talking about for extra costs, we would certainly bid for that. But that's our set budget. And
So for you to do what you'd ideally like to do, are you talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands? What?
I think you're not talking hundreds of thousands, no.
Okay.
No. I mean, the system itself is relatively basic and scalable. What we don't know, because we never had to develop an app, for example, is how much it would cost. The complexity of the Excel spreadsheet is something we'd want to look at as well. But and regardless of whether we could afford it, I think it would still be a good idea to be able to price this. And it was certainly our intention, having heard these views expressed again a couple of weeks ago, that we would go off and do that now as well. So we know.
If you could share that with the committee when you get that back, that would be fantastic
Yeah, of
as part
course,
of our considerations. Graham Simpson.
Yeah, thanks, convener. One of my frustrations, whenever I sort of look at the register, so say I look at myself, and you'll see a list of meetings that I've had. I can click on one meeting, and that'll show me what that meeting was. But then I have to go back to stage one, and I have right back to the start. So I have to look up my name, go back and look at the list of meetings again. Instead of it just opening up a new box when I click on a meeting, you have to go right back to the beginning. So it's really difficult to use. Is that something you've looked at?
It's something I wasn't aware of until you raised it 2 weeks ago.
Right.
Probably because we use it in a slightly different way. When you get your, you do your search under Graham Simpson, get your 230 odd returns or whatever, we then just use the CSV function, which gives you all of them, and then we filter information that way. But I didn't realise until you mentioned it last week, and I went and checked, and it does work that way.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't. So
It shouldn't.
We'll put that in the enhancements document.
Right. Okay.
There is a button I noticed, without getting too technical. If you're just looking at the original list, you can do a refined search. But the point that you're talking about is when you go in, you can't easily get back.
No.
So we'll look into that.
Okay.
There's also there's one other aspect to that. Again, we were just looking at this last night, specifically after you'd said that. So, as you say, if you call up a search with all your returns, what we do, and again, this might be really probably quite obvious, but if you right-click on that hyperlink, it does open it up in a window. So you could see that meeting, that will pop up as a separate window. So it would still leave all of your other returns on another window. So you wouldn't have to go all the way back. So again, potentially something that you might look at, but I appreciate it's not always obvious.
Right. Okay. Well, that it's good that I've pointed in the right direction. Yeah. So you mentioned this IT enhancement document. Apart from the issue I've raised, what other aspects are you looking to improve?
I mean, just now, I don't know if you want to answer that, James, in terms of you leading the document. But.
Yeah. We've certainly looked at a lot of our registrants, because they work to statutory time periods. There's not something in the information return screen which tells them which period they're submitting for. So we're looking at maybe the system being a bit more intuitive to be able to allow organisations to know for which period they're submitting. Again, Billy had already mentioned the description field, and again, this is free text just now, and it's constantly something that we're having to change. It's rare that we ever get a perfect description field text in, so again, we're looking at automation in terms of being able to just tick a box in terms of what type of event it was. Was it a video conference? Was it a party conference? Was it a seminar? Even a sort of a social event, that type of thing. So all of that would be there, but that would probably be the biggest change. One of the other aspects that we were looking at, and again it refers to the data integrity of putting in constituencies or ministerial titles. We've looked at the drop-down field for when you insert an MSP name or a minister's name, that we would actually have in there that what their constituency was, or say it was an MSP, sorry, a cabinet secretary who'd maybe held 2 or 3 different titles, having their actual cabinet secretary title and the date, so that people would be able to pinpoint what date it was they were lobbying and in what capacity.
Okay. Do you have any information on who actually accesses the register? Is it organisations, individuals, journalists, lobbyists? Have you got a breakdown?
I don't actually know. I'd be happy to ask the IT contractors to provide us with stats on that basis, but I don't have anything of that nature to hand. But it would be good information to get hold of.
Do you think it's even possible to get it?
Yes, I think it would be. I mean, I don't know if we'll be able to access it at the level of telling you who has done it, but certainly it's common practice to have information and stats about hits. I'm always a bit wary about hits because it doesn't give you a drill down, if you like. But I'd be happy to look at that.
Okay.
Ourselves. I'm sorry, I'm just saying the hits would maybe include ourselves. We use the system day in, day out. So
Of course. I can see the technical difficulties. Can I just ask one more question, convener? It's not really related to this, but it's in terms of what people put when they're putting something on the register. So if I use myself as an example, if I led for my party on the planning bill, so I had lots and lots of meetings with people to do with that, and there would generally be met Graham Simpson to discuss concerns over the planning bill. But that doesn't tell you an awful lot. But that, do you think the level of detail is enough?
I think this hits to the crux of what some of the evidence has been given, where there's a frustration that we ask for too much sometimes. So we have to strike the balance, and I think it can be difficult for people in terms of finding that balance. We're dealing, as I mentioned, with organisations who are sometimes not used to being described as lobbyists. Some people find it very easy. I mean, you'll find that for something like the planning bill, for example, some people will just easily be able to write what they came to talk about, what their asks were, and what they'd like to see. And that essentially is a good return. And that's what we'd look for, and that's what we'd aim to publish. People get a bit frustrated when we go back to say, can you just try and set this out in that way? We did produce guidance on this last year, which maybe hasn't quite had the impact yet that we'd hope. And essentially, you can't really go much wrong if you follow what that is. I mean, again, as mentioned, there's a bit of confusion between the description box and the purpose box. Now, in the Irish system, you've got 2 boxes as well, which is intended results and other stuff. I think if we can just get people to focus on that purpose box in the manner that you've just suggested, that would be ideal for us. And that's why we've done an awful lot of work, and without continuing this on, we can tell you all the work we've done in terms of engaging with stakeholders on that. I do understand the frustration. Sometimes these people aren't the front line people who are putting the returns in, they're just coordinating returns, and they get frustrated having to go back and ask a chief executive or something like that. And I can understand that, but we're trying to get to the point you just very succinctly described, is that's all we need. We need to know, I mean, it says in the guidance, it needs to be clear and understandable. It also has to be clear to readers. I mean, we don't all have assumed knowledge on the intricacies of the planning bill. We'd like to know what it was happened.
Okay, thank you.
Mr Simpson, before I go to John Mason, just picking up on who accesses or who requests information, do you get press inquiries?
From time to time.
Relating to an individual submission or general stats?
I don't think we've had anything particular about an individual submission that I can remember. I don't.
the ones that come to mind for me initially are more on topics. which escape me right now, but it's more been about has someone asked about this certain topic of how many returns might be related to, say, Edinburgh Airport is something that comes into mind.
Right. But none about any specific submissions?
I mean, as you know, the Parliament press inquiries will come through the press office and we will be asked for factual information.
Yep.
It's public data, so it's there.
How often?
I'd probably say a handful of times in the last couple of years. I mean, I think in terms of journalists, we've always said we were happy to brief them on how the register works, and
Yep.
nobody's really took us up on that.
Handful being 5 in 2 years, or less than 5?
I would say around about that, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
I don't take a note of exactly what they are, but yeah. I mean, I think journalists find it a wee bit difficult to, because of the way the Act's constructed. I mean, you've got 6 months, up to 6 months, to put a return on it if you wish to.
Yeah, and the story's gone.
Sorry?
6 months later, the story's gone.
So there's a topicality aspect there. Maybe what they were expecting is not quite what the Act actually provides. But also, you know, it's good for long-term research. I think if you're looking at journalists, I think you'll probably find more investigative journalism would be
Yep.
using this type of resource.
James, do you want to come in, then I'll come back to you with a supplementary, Billy McLaren?
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, in terms of journalists using the system, and again, it's maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding on the part of how you use the system, but we've seen some email addresses that have come in which relate to newspaper titles, and I think it's been journalists that think they have to register on the system to go and be able to search. And again, when we've gone back to them to say it's not a requirement for you to register to search it again. So we've seen 1 or 2 newspapers that have been journalists that have tried to register, I presume with the intention of being able to search the register and see who's been lobbying.
Have you had any FOI requests?
No.
Not that I remember.
I mean, partly because we are, the information is published. I mean, we've always said that anything that we do in terms of communications between us and stakeholders is FOIable, clearly.
Yep.
So, I mean, but no.
Okay. And going back to the point you raised about the 6 months, it does ask the question whether 6 months is too long. Should it be? We had that from our evidence and from our previous panels. Is 6 months too long? Should it be less? What's a better time frame?
I mean, I think these are probably going into areas of policy, which as parliamentary officials we wouldn't. What I would say is something the committee might want to look at is harmonised dates. Every registrant has a different date. It depends on when they register, or it depends on when they first lobbied. So it's the earliest date. So there's a lot of chopping and changing with dates. I think that does, even though we send out a reminder 2 weeks before the end period and we give them information about what their dates are, and James has talked about improving data on the website to make it clearer for them as well. We do find that can lead to sometimes people being confused or forgetting, and you know, there's quite a high level of emails we send out in terms of non-compliance because they forget to put returns in. So maybe harmonisation of dates, whatever the timings of it is one thing, but the harmonisation might be something that's worth looking at. I don't want to go into
No, I recognise you don't want to get into policy areas, Billy McLaren, but I think your answer did suggest that 6 months is perhaps too long.
I mean, it's done differently in other areas, certainly. I think Highlands 3 times a year, for example. I mean, we'd probably see it as neutral to us in terms of administration. If it's more return dates, then we would have a bit more work to do in compliance, but maybe the harmonisation of the dates might help in terms of reducing compliance, so we've not got any strong opinion.
James Drummond?
Yeah, and again, I think this goes back to the written evidence that you've received and what you heard a fortnight ago. It's almost like it's based around the topicality of the system. And again, for the committee's information, I mean, it is worth reminding that organisations don't have to wait 6 months or however long it is to the end of their deadline before submitting. I mean, registrants can submit at any point that they wish during reporting periods, and it's perfectly acceptable, of course, for some organisations to wait until their deadline, but the Act and the Register allow for that flexibility. I mean, again, for us, in a practical sense, if organisations were submitting little and often, and that actually means for us it's a good chance where we have queries that we go back on, it's still fresh in the memory of the the individuals that have engaged. And sometimes, I mean, if we wait 6 months, or if we get a return that was 4 or 5 months old, we go back to an organisation to seek further details or clarity, the person that might have engaged in that regulated lobbying may have moved on, or memory has faded. So again, we do say that little and often can be the case for organisations for submitting, and it would make it more topical.
Thank you, James Drummond. I can see that Alec Neil, who's joining us remotely, wishes to come in, so I'll go over to Alec Neil.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Can I move the discussion a wee bit from process to impact? If you look at the freedom of information legislation, the impact is very obvious down the years. I mean, the Westminster expenses scandal was probably the best example of the impact of FOI, and I personally think it's been a good thing, unlike Tony Blair. But I'm not clear, and I'm not seeing impact on the lobbying register. Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticising you guys. I think you guys are doing a good job as always. But and I take the point, you haven't yet done a systematic, properly researched impact assessment. But you're at the front end on this. So have you observed any impact of the register on, for example, we sign a register of interest. One of the impacts of that is we have to declare in a debate if we have an interest, even if it's not registered. But I have never heard anyone refer in debate to having been lobbied in terms of this act. I've never heard of any changes in behaviour, either by those being lobbied or the lobbyists. So have you seen any impact? You know, let's go back to what the bill was supposed to do, which was to try to bring out into the open lobbying. But has it really done that? You know, what's your kind of experience?
Billy McLaren.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Neil. I mean, it's difficult to gauge, as you know, and I've heard the conversations of the previous session on this as well. I mean, I think it probably can help as a deterrent for inappropriate behaviour, if you like. I mean, what it has done is set up a legal obligation to report face-to-face lobbying, and there's a code of conduct, as you will know, for those who lobby you as MSPs. And if there were criminal activities, you know, these can go straight to the Crown Office. Investigations can be carried out by the Commissioner for ethical standards, which can result in a report being brought forward to Parliament to apply sanctions. And I think that reputational aspect is something which hangs over everybody every day. It's a very important factor in this. So I think the fact we haven't seen much of an impact suggests, and I think the annual report bears it out, there's not been an awful lot of massive compliance issues with this. There may be more of an impact, or maybe more of a news story if something were to happen that challenges that, but we haven't seen anything so far. So yeah, I mean, I think people are generally compliant, they're putting their returns in, we're starting to see what those returns mean. We can start to assess that 11,000 plus returns in terms of where they lie. We're seeing where they lie, you know, in terms of third sector, companies, business, etc. So I don't think there's any big impact in that sense, but we are seeing more of a pattern emerging than a picture emerging. I'm not sure that answers the question entirely, but that's...
But how do you identify non-compliance?
Very, very basic. It's a process thing. I mean, if people don't submit returns by the deadline we give, then we follow it up. That's an area of non-compliance. So, in terms
but if they don't submit, you will just accept that as nothing happened. That's not a way of ensuring there's compliance, surely.
No, we issue an email and we make sure that they come back into compliance by getting those returns in. If we don't get a response to the email, then we send a letter to the senior person responsible in the company. So, that's what we've found that's effective.
But do you accept that if on you go, Alec Neil?
Well, compliance is not impact. I mean, I think there are two separate issues.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'll let the convener later on ask you more about compliance. What I'm interested in is impact. Yes. And the fact you've said, Billy, that there's been no impact, obvious impact. I mean, I don't know of any change in behaviour. And if you take the example of Graham Simpson's example on the planning bill, And, you know, we now know that somebody tried to lobby Graham Simpson on the planning bill. We don't know if what that lobbying was about a specific planning issue, planning application, about a policy issue, other than Graham, and we're all in this position, not just Graham Simpson, and the lobbyists, we don't know. We therefore don't know if anything untoward took place. You know, if that lobbying was about a very specific planning issue that was under consideration or appeal, for example, with the Scottish Government, and Graham, and I'm absolutely sure this is not the case, by the way, I'm just picking Graham because he mentioned it, and we find out later that as a result of that, Graham had lobbied ministers, formally or informally. You know, we don't know any of that. So if we don't know any of that, what's the whole point of the exercise?
Can I just firstly say that Graham Simpson's happy to confirm there was nothing inappropriate. So, Billy McLaren.
I mean, without continuing this particular non-example, I mean, what that return would say and should say is what the lobbying was. So you should be able to gauge from that. So I went to fictional, of course, well, perhaps not, but I engaged on section such and such. I wanted amendments to be raised. I mean, what the lobbying should be saying is how you lobbied a member in relation to legislation, policy, contracts, licenses, or whether you want them to raise something on your behalf. I think it does.
So
I mean,
we're not doing that, Billy. So no, but if you pick the example that Graham told us about, so the lobbyist puts in a submission. I lobbied Graham Simpson and no doubt many other MSPs on the planning bill, and that's what they put in. Do you go back to the lobbyist and say this is not detailed enough? We need to know what you lobbied them specifically about.
Yes, that's what we try to do. And in some cases, it's easier. With a big bill like the planning bill, we certainly would go back and try and get more information about the particular aspects of what were lobbied on in relation to that particular bill. Some things are more obvious.
So if I went and checked that specific entry, I would now get more detail than what the original submission included.
When it comes to us, to explain our process, there's 4 of us in the team, so we sit down every day with all the returns that come in from the day before. So there's a degree of consistency in terms of how we approach these things. Clearly, we're 11,000 plus, we're not going to get it right every time. But before we publish, we would look to make sure we've got the most information we can have on that particular information return. And we'd like to do that before we submit. And before we publish that return. So that's the intention. That's what we try and do as a team. That should allow you to build up a pattern of, on a big bill like that, for example, I think that's probably one of the biggest pieces of legislation that's been lobbied on. Just instinctively from the number of returns that we've seen on the issue. It was a big act. It covered a lot of different territory. And lots of different types of territory. So we would, in that particular act, look to seek to find out exactly what that organisation was focusing on in their meeting with Mr Simpson.
That's an important topic, because if you look at the history, the most prominent civil servant, Poulsen, who was never convicted for fraud and so on, it was a planning issue. And in local government, 9 times out of 10, any fraud cases are very often about getting a bung for a planning issue. So actually, planning is a very, very good example. If the purpose of this bill, of this act, is to try to root out any fraudulent behaviour and the like, then the planning bill's a very good example of where it has to be done properly, because traditionally it's been the single main source of corruption amongst public officials in the few cases we've had locally and nationally. So my question is, if we're not asking that detail in every case, as you would be required to do in Register of Interest or in FOI, it's fairly standard. Surely we have to be doing that if the Lobbying Act is going to serve its purpose. I mean, so do you not have the resources to do it? Or are you just selective about how you do it? Or how do you judge where you need to go back and get and get the detail. How many times have you done it? What percentages of cases do you go back and ask for more detail so that we can be sure that the purpose behind the Lobbying Act has been served?
That is our bread and butter. I mean, that's what we do. Is that there's 4 of us get together every day, and we look down, we assess. Clearly, we've all looked at nearly 11,000 returns, or possibly more than that, because you remember we delete quite a number as well. There's a 10%, 11% deletion rate, stuff that clearly isn't regulated lobbying. So we have that day-to-day experience. It always goes back to what we say in the guidance, that the return has to be clear and understood by readers of the register, what the lobbying was, who's lobbied, when they lobbied, and what they lobbied on. And that's the test we apply to that. It does vary.
But it's the definition of the latter point, what you lobbied on. In the case that Graham highlighted, the submission was that they lobbied Graham on the Planning Act. But what aspect of the Planning Act appears not to have been included? So if it's not included, the thing is absolutely worthless, quite frankly.
Well, we, over time, and that's partly what you're hearing in the complaint about us sending information returns back when we're looking for more detail. So we do that. We do drill down to that, and we do try and get exactly what you're describing, Mr. Neil. We try and get something there which explains what the lobbying was. That's our bottom line. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But one final question. I mean, this week is a very good example. There are many weeks that are good examples at the moment, but there is a bill, Bibby's bill, up for decision today, the Tide Pubs bill. Now, I have been lobbied on that bill more than I've been lobbied on anything else other than coronavirus-related stuff, which has overwhelmed us all, I think. But that lobbying's all been done by email, part of a campaign on both sides of the argument by numerous organisations for and against the bill. And it's quite clearly, quite legitimately, by the way, in a democratic society, lobbying to vote for the bill or lobbying to vote against the bill. So I could pick many examples. I mean, the number of people who are lobbying us at the moment to ensure that after the 11th of December, every gym in the country is opened up and not kept shut because of coronavirus. And that's from a whole range of people and organisations. So how do we account for that kind of lobbying? I know there's a policy issue in there that you can't answer, but is there any of that you would say, as the man in charge, should be captured by the existing Lobbying Act?
I mean, there's lobbying of all different types and descriptions, you say. So you can lobby through social media, you can lobby through campaign emails, you can lobby through written correspondence, you can use emails, you can lobby face-to-face. And the Act, as it is just now, is set as face-to-face. And I think, to go back to kind of sort of to the impact thing, we have seen an awful lot of returns, probably more than we expected, for just face-to-face lobbying. And I think that's given us an idea of what amount of lobbying is out there just on that particular scope. In terms of moving on, I wouldn't enter into that kind of policy decision. But yeah, I mean, this is one part of transparency. If, as I said at the start of the session, if you have more lobbying interactions, you can start to form more of a picture, obviously, but you've got to balance that against the administrative burden and costs for organisations, etc.
So if somebody comes on a Zoom call, or a Microsoft Teams call with me to lobby, is that technically a face-to-face lobbying under the Act?
Yes, that is.
Right. And have you had much Zoom lobbying?
I think we checked last week, and I think we're up to 346 video conferences. And obviously they've increased substantially since the impact of no in-person engagement, if you like. So yeah, they're on the rise.
I think that henceforth that's going to be a big growth industry within your sector.
We're seeing a lot of it just now, yes.
Yeah, great. That's fine. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. Can I just pick up on that? So I know you don't want to get into the policy part of it, But going by the definition of lobbying that has to be registered in terms of face-to-face meetings, you accept that the same definition would apply, perhaps not whether they're covered by the Act or not, but the definition applies to written communication, including emails, etc. So the principle in terms of the definition of the lobbying goes beyond face-to-face.
Yes, I mean, there's lobbying of all different types. The definition, I think, I mean, one thing I would say on the definition, again, to maybe assist stakeholders in the future, is that what I've just mentioned there about, it's actually in the Act. We don't put it in the 5 key steps, which James could probably take you through, but we talk about government or parliamentary functions, but you could use what's in the Act to make it more specific. So it relates to legislation, policy, contracts, etc. I mean, I'll not read out the list, but that's kind of what we're looking for. And that would help with the point we're making with the Mr Simpson example, that people, when they're writing these, first of all, if they're going and having that meeting, they want to say what it is it relates to in relation to policy or legislation and so forth.
And again, not asking you to give a policy opinion, but if written communications, for example, emails, etc., were to be included, is that too much of an administrative burden as it currently stands for you to deliver it? And is that a consideration?
Yeah, I mean, whatever the decision is of the committee, that's the point of having the review. And as long as the resources there, then clearly you can do that. It's just getting that balance again, and that's. I understand that's difficult. It's difficult to assess the impact as well at this stage, and it is a bit of a chicken and egg thing.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, we're here to do whatever.
Okay. I'll come back to you on the compliance question that came to my mind from Mr Neils, but Mr Mason's been waiting a long time, so I'm going to hand over to John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. And actually, I was just going to start there before I go on to the kind of future. But because you've mentioned that I was interested in that figure of 11,000 or over 11,000, I think, returns that have been published. I mean, have you any way of knowing how many should have been published? Would it be 15,000, 20,000, whatever?
I mean, if it's submitted to us, then we'll do that process will be described. And if we think it's not regulated lobbying, then we'll go back and give advice that maybe doesn't fit, or there's an exemption perhaps applies. We'll maybe point that out to them as well. So they can end up being returns that I've submitted that would then be deleted because they're not regulated lobbying.
Yes, I'm thinking more of the ones that haven't been submitted. I mean, in the first, I kept a list myself for the first 6 months or a year of who was registering, because then I saw the event come through. And so I reckon, maybe 80% of ones that I thought should have been registered were registered. So, I mean, it may have improved, but say there was 20% just not appearing in the system at all, you wouldn't really know that, would you?
We wouldn't, but it would depend on whether an exemption applied. So we don't know what we don't know. If somebody applies, for example, the constituency exemption because they've met you on that basis.
Yes, but my judgment is this is apart from constituency ones, obviously.
Right, okay, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think at least to start with, there was definitely some not being registered. So then you just wouldn't know about that. Okay. I mean, the other area I wanted to move on is more of the future, and I accept that, I'll ask the Minister about that as to the policy, but I'm thinking more of the practicalities in both what Mr Neil said and the convener said about, the practicalities of what you can actually do. I mean, cost is another factor that's not taken into account, because I would have thought a member of the public would be more interested if a business takes me out for a dinner for an hour than I meet a little charity and I buy them a coffee for an hour. So, but in our system, that cost factor just doesn't come into it at all. Is that right? And could it? I mean, is that something that could easily be done?
I mean, I think in terms of the rules around hospitality for members, there's already existing rules through the existing structures. It's not something that comes into this legislation.
No. So, I mean, I don't know enough about the IT side, and also, I mean, you've got 4 full-time staff on this subject. Is that how it works?
We do now, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you were to bring in extra things like the emails or like phone calls or like the cost, any of these possibilities that have been mentioned, would you be talking, or have you just no idea how many more staff you would need? Would you need to double your staff or what?
Yeah. I mean, on that front, we're better we were probably better able to assess it now than we were at the very beginning. The original financial memorandum that was prepared by the Scottish Government estimated between 255 and 2,550 registrants. So organisations that are, we've got 1,200, so we're well past that midway point. The more registrants you have, inevitably there's a correlation to the amount of information returns you have. So the more information returns you have, whether, regardless of what the communication is, then obviously you need to have staff to administer that. So I think we've got a reasonable idea that we're managing just about with 4 just now, with the capacity that we're looking at just now. We could probably do some. I wouldn't have an idea of adding to the scope how much that would then result in. Maybe to get some professional work done on that.
Yes.
But we do know how we work within our current capacity.
But so any addition would have an impact both on the kind of actual system investment in the IT and a staffing impact as well.
Yes, and maybe as a reassurance, I mean, we are parliamentary officials. This is a parliament administered scheme. Corporate bodies are paying rations. We've certainly highlighted the committee's looking at this review, and you know, any change that adds to the scope will obviously add to the administrative costs for the Parliament.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Convener.
Bill Bowman.
Convener. Can I just pick up, perhaps, since most of the questions I think have probably been through, some things you said earlier. I think, Mr McLaren, you spoke about reviewing returns. And I think you're saying that you do this real time as opposed to historically. Do you make judgments when you look at the returns? Do you think, oh, I wonder what's going on here? You know, what's this person up to? Or maybe this member has never had a return or very few. I wonder if that's right. Do you do that? Do you report it to somebody?
I think the only judgment we make is, does it tell us who's been lobbied and what they've been lobbied about? That's kind of the bottom line. We're very keen to see the purpose box reflect what happened at that, whether it be a meeting, a discussion, an event, etc., etc. That's kind of how we would approach it.
So you make no judgments on what's gone on?
Generally speaking, I don't think we're required to.
No, there's nothing that when we read it, we think, oh, right, okay, this is what's happening. Ours is, I think Billy used the phrase bread and butter. We are there to administer it, look at what has been put in the content of an information return with a view to ensuring that it's published for the public to be able to read and see what's been going on.
Okay. In the, you know, when I look at these returns, I get an email, I think, and I click on it and go and look at it. I don't think anybody's ever said I was lobbied. Do people use the term lobbied?
Some people do, and we find it useful if they say it. And there's certain key language phrases which are better, I think, for readers of the Register to say I lobbied on this part of such and such bill. I lobbied because I want the member to support my campaign. And I would like to hear say that it's actually a good thing, you know, to people to say that it's not a bad thing. And there may be a wee bit of that. We talked about it earlier, that people aren't used to this idea of them being lobbyists, and maybe don't use the term as much. But even just saying that we raised the issue of such and such indicates that it's something that they care about and they're looking for change, and that's why they're talking to you as a member.
Because it usually says, you know, we discussed or you spoke about something. So is lobby a dirty word?
No, but I think I mentioned the guidance that we've prepared, which does actually give a template to how to write these things, and it's just to make it clearer. So I think whatever language you use, as long as it indicates what you were trying to achieve, is a very good thing to put in a return. But what you actually were there to discuss is useful. What you raised is useful.
I'm not so sure that lobby isn't a word that, you know, people are a little bit concerned about. If I said you were lobbying me or you are a lobbyist.
I think it still has connotations of that, and you're right, but the question being, do I think is a dirty word? No. I mean, I think lobbying is a fundamental process that allows us to do the jobs that we do in here. I mean, that's what people should come and look for changes to legislation, express views, etc.
I think you also mentioned you had something like a deletion rate of, was it 11%? Is that the whole return that's deleted or just aspects of it?
Yeah, it's the whole return, and that would be for whatever reason, such as we've gone back to an organisation to raise whether they've considered an exemption might apply. be that they've sent something through that actually isn't a form of lobbying communication. I mean, we still sometimes have users would submit something saying we submitted a letter or we made a phone call. So again, that's a quite clear not regulated lobbying. Or we would see stuff where organisations would say they participated in a working group, and again, we would, for example, we would say, have you considered that there could be a comms on request element to this? Could be a Scottish Government working group to which they're invited to participate in. So those are the type of things that we would go back. Those are the deletion types.
So this would be by agreement. You wouldn't just delete something.
We won't delete anything without confirmation from a registered user that they're in agreement. It's for them to take the decision. We'll point them in the right direction to consider, could this be exempt? We're not in the meetings when they have these communications, so they would be the ones that would have to take the decision, right, okay, we've agreed that probably is not a regulated lobbying communication, you may delete this.
And do you ever get the comeback from them, oh, but we'd rather put it in just in case? There's a sort of fear that if they don't make a return, they could be in trouble.
I think there's always been a bit of a fear where people have erred on the side of caution right from the very start because they don't want to fall foul of any non-compliance. So organisations will come back to us, but again, we'll often go back and say, this is what you should think. We always talk about underpinning it with the 5 key steps in the guidance. Look at that. Did you communicate about Scottish Government or Scottish parliamentary functions? Were you seeking to inform or influence? Just to maybe get them to focus their mind on what the communication was.
So, and just finally, do you look for sort of GDPR issues, that there's maybe disclosing information about individuals that shouldn't be in a public statement?
The only one that comes to mind straight away would be in terms of the location. I mean, every return has to have the location and where it took place. And again, more than ever with the upturn in video conferencing taking place, a lot of people are working from home. So one of the things that we do say is that if it was initiated from a person's home, as most people are working, we ask them to just put private residence and address withheld. So I mean, that's one thing about in terms of personal data.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Joanne Lamont.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just say, on this issue of lobbying, I think the distinction is between a lobbyist and somebody who's lobbying. I mean, it's a tradition in the Labour movement that you would go and lobby Parliament. It was perceived as a thing that you would do, but it was a campaign. But a lobbyist, I think the distinction is somebody who's paid to lobby. So that, I mean, does that come out in your analysis of your own figures about effectively consultants, lobbyists, as opposed to people who are participating in campaigns? Can you, because I'm quite interested in just maybe make a more general question. What is the balance of people who are on the register between private, third sector and public sector, and the balance between people who are, I would say, engaging in citizen participation and people are funded to lobby? Do you have those figures?
Yeah, I mean, the Act makes no distinction as to whether somebody is a corporate lobbyist in the traditional sense or whether they would do a bit of lobbying as part of their own job as such. So
But it would still be a job?
it's to do with job, and it has to be paid.
Right, okay.
And that can be paid in any, apart from some minor expenses, that can be paid in any capacity. So a public affairs officer at a large charity, for example, is considered under the Act as being somebody who would be lobbying on stuff. There's figures in the annual report, which I'm happy to share, but just roughly speaking, 40% of it seems to be around the third sector of the total number of organisations registered. There's about 1,200, and it's the next highest category was certainly company, so businesses lobbying.
Okay, and in terms of your, I mean, obviously, the capacity to do the job at a point where, it's more than just a tick box exercise, is about the budget you're given. Who determines your budget?
Corporate body.
The corporate body, and is there anything bottom line around what your functions that would stop the budget either being reduced or not increased sufficiently for you to do your job? What is the protection of your budget?
I mean, clearly what the committee's got the powers to do under this Act is to make statutory change. So whatever statutory change is made, then the Parliament needs to reflect that, and obviously the corporate body would need to get an consideration in terms of its budget setting. That's kind of how it operates. We work within the window we're given within if you like, the remit that we have. If that remit changes and it's a statutory change, then we've already flagged up to the corporate body, as I mentioned, that if there's, you know, a degree of change that goes up or down, then, you know, we need to look at the resources that would be in according with that remit.
Okay, and I'm interested in the impact of the pandemic and more generally. So as the register has developed, have you been tracking the changes in who use it, how early they register, how quickly they do? There's a bit in the papers which talks about if you get a report on lobbying on a bill that passed 3 months ago, it doesn't really inform you about how government got to a position where it was doing certain things or changed its mind or whatever. So are you tracking so that kind of ease of access, the groups who access, and so on, so that you can get a sense of, you know, is it developing over time, and have you detected any patterns of change?
I mean, I mentioned the annual report earlier, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal of change in terms of the groups, if you like, and the organisations and the proportions of those groups between the end of June 2019 and the end of June 2020. We still have people registering, so people lobbying for the first time realise they have to get registered, and maybe had that information from an MSP themselves that said, you know, you met me, make sure you're in compliance with the Act. So we still see a fair number of people coming through, and the numbers have gone up again. So we're now, last year, I think when we did the annual report, it was 1088, and this year we're just short of 1200. So there's a steady climb. And we work with those new registrants coming on just to make, it's actually quite easy in a way, because at the start we had 70% of the registrants registered within 3 months. So we had a big glut at the start. Now, as new registrants come on, it's good to work with them at the start and work on them in terms of how you would provide a decent information return, etc. So I'm not sure that quite answers the question, but that's how we deal with new registrants coming on.
I just more that your experience of it. I just wondered whether you see patterns of behaviour or changing behaviour or changing use. But you're saying it's steady. Do you expect the report next year to be quite different then? Because of the pandemic?
Necessarily. I think I'm not saying after 2 years it's in a settled pattern, but there doesn't seem to be a big change. We're not seeing all of a sudden a new type of organisation coming through who's lobbying heavily, for example. We do produce data with the annual report which says who all the organisations are, and that's quite useful for us because we've been...
Which they lobbied? Because the most obvious one, most straightforward one is the meeting. But that kind of meet and greet, come along and celebrate an anniversary, and while the person's there, there is direct lobbying happening, but it's like, well, it's what's now disappeared, which is literally the garden lobby. It's no longer there because of the pandemic. But that kind of, you know, is that visible in your report?
Visible in the information returns, and I suppose with a bit of analysis you could actually go and look and see how many were in the Scottish Parliament pre-COVID. They gave you some figures there, mainly because they're very prominent in their mind just now with video conferences, but we could certainly do analysis to see where the lobbying is being done, if you like.
I would think that there may be more lobbying because Zoom meetings are an awful lot easier to organise than getting somebody into a physical space. But I want, this is maybe a slightly facetious point, but I'm pretty resistant to modern technology, so if I'm in a Zoom meeting, I tend to go in audio rather than face-to-face. Would that be a way of avoiding it? Recording it as a face-to-face meeting?
I mean, it's something that I think we heard raised in the previous evidence sessions also. It's not something that we're aware of or any suggestion that people are switching off cameras deliberately as a tactic to avoid registering communication.
Make a difference?
Sorry?
Technically, would I be within my rights to say I've not lobbied that person because we actually used the audio facility, we used the Zoom facility, but it was as if it were a phone call? Yeah.
So in the Act, Section 1, it says in terms of what regulated lobbying communications are, and it talks about the use of video communication. So it says is intended to enable. So Again, this is maybe clarification that was required on that text to address video conferences, and that could actually be because there's maybe technical difficulties that prevents a user from being able to have a camera switched on.
Essentially, you have to be seen and heard. So if you've made a conscious decision to just use that facility for audio purposes, and I don't think we'll be able to capture it under the existing language.
So a Zoom call, which is the equivalent of somebody coming in to see me in the Parliament, but I don't use the video. This maybe it's a marginal point in a lot of ways, but I'm just wondering if you're looking to find ways of avoiding things, which we're trying to capture what people are doing, the system has to move with the world that we're now living in, which is very different, and I just wondered it'd be worthwhile reflecting that. Can my last point, I'm conscious of going on a bit, to what extent do you see your role as being part of the broader purpose of this Lobbying Act? Because I think people say, well, is it really working and how would we ever know? Well, that applies to any law. It's for those whose job it is to enforce, to establish who's not doing something they should be doing. But for people who are engaging with the process in an open and honest way, they're engaging with you. So your job is to record people who are abiding with the law. It's for others to identify, maybe an investigative journalist who you identify, well, actually, there's an absence of information here. They've not given that information. We've got evidence here that it's happened. To what extent do you see yourselves as a function or an administrative role in this, or more broadly part of that commitment to transparency? Because I don't think we should forget what the original purpose of the legislation was, which was that people feared that some would have a greater influence on government and decision makers than others, and it wasn't visible to the rest of us who were wrestling with these arguments and these decisions. So do you see yourself in that broader landscape, and is there anything we should be saying that you need to help you in that role? Or is there anything inhibiting you from that role?
We see ourselves as part of the broader aim of increasing transparency by the work we do. We are proactive, and if we see newspaper articles or social media which suggests that somebody might not be aware of the requirements to we will email organisations. We haven't had any direct evidence of evasion from anybody, but if we did, we would obviously take it up with the organisation concerned. And of course there is, when you get to that level of investigations, that can be carried out by the Commissioner for Ethical Standards. But we're committed to getting all the information on that we can to make it as transparent as possible.
Do you record that anywhere? So for example, if you thought that the government had, for example, somewhere else had reported that had this pressure from or the discussion with, and you looked in the register and it's not there, would you report that somewhere? I mean,
if we had a kind of whistleblower type situation, which we haven't had, the first thing we'd look at is the reasons why that information might not have been recorded, but if a good reason to approach an organisation to ask the question. I mean, what we want to say to them is, are you aware of the requirements? Because, we want to make sure that you're complying with the Act. So, yeah, we try to be as proactive as we can within the resources that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think Graham Simpson wanted to come back in with a supplementary.
Yeah, I just want to clear up this business of using Zoom or Teams, and if you haven't got your camera on, because I'm pretty sure we took evidence on this. It was raised, and I think my reading of the Act is that the Act says if you use a platform like that enables where you can have a video call, that is lobbying whether or not you use the video facility or not. Am I correct in that?
I think, when you have the Scottish Government in next, I think the piece of the Act was written at a time we could never have foreseen this situation. I think what we would say is, as James mentioned, the Act talks about intended to enable. So if people make a decision to use video conference facilities but to not be seen and heard.
So the key phrase there is intended to enable. So if I go on to Teams, for instance, which it can enable me to use a video facility, and I choose not to, the facility is still there. So surely that's covered.
Well, this is the question I think we probably would need to see what the intention was from the Scottish Government. We would say that it also says you have to be intending to see and hear. So our advice is that see and hear has to be part of that equation. So if you decide not to use the see function because you're just using the equipment, you're not intending to use the equipment to see and hear. So I think it's something that does need looked at, and I'm sure the people who had the intentions of writing it would be able to clarify it, and we'd certainly value some clarity on it, but that's how we read it. And I think it's been written from a perspective that nobody could have envisaged 3 or 4 years ago.
We need to clear that up for your sake.
Thank you. I think there's just one area we probably haven't covered yet, which is around the exemptions and then the compliance around the exemptions. Billy McCann, you yourself in your comments in the annual report of 2019 highlighted a number of and gave some comments around a number of the exemptions and sought further clarity, or thought further clarity was required. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I'm conscious of your time. We did highlight 4 exemptions, which causes some administrative. I'll just very briefly say what they were, if that's okay.
Please do.
So the communications made to a member of a constituency or region, there's quite a lot in that, and I don't know if we've got time to cover it. But
So please
Okay,
just
good.
say what you need to say.
Right, well, I mean, on that particular exemption, the fundamental problem we've had in administering it is that there's a lack of definition around this phrase ordinarily carried on. So the constituency exemption, if I can put it in shorthand, is applied by the organisation, because there's no definition of what ordinarily carried on means, if they conduct business in the constituency where it's actively carrying on their business or where they're located. So if you're in there or if you carry on business in there, that's fine. But I think what the problem we've had is big organisations. So organisations that spread themselves across Scotland. So it could be a utility company, it could be a church, it could be. They're finding it really difficult to make a decision on whether or not they ordinarily carry on their activities or their business in that area. The only advice we've been able to give, and we did actually, we have to formally consult Scottish ministers on the parliamentary guidance. So the best guidance we could get with that, which was then agreed by the government, is it's really up to them to decide that. And I think what that's doing is creating a bit of angst and a bit of inconsistency. So some people were wanting, quite rightly saying, well, we can only really apply that to Scottish ministers because they're exempt from this exemption. So that's been raised with us, and it was raised very early on as something come the review it'd be good to have another look at. The other one was around payment, and again, there's no definition in terms of a threshold or a de minimis level. So, for example, they gave in the report is that you could have a situation where somebody's given a small gift, for example, who's not normally an employee of the organisation, and that kind of just sits there forever, and they're worried about whether or not that constitutes payment. So one aspect was maybe you could have a de minimis or a time period even to say, well, you know, that gift doesn't apply after a certain period. And again, we said we'd raise that on behalf of the working group. The small organisations exemption, this is the exemption that applies a threshold based on 10 full-time employees, and that's if you're below that, you don't have to register, you don't have to submit returns. That, again, doesn't apply to representative bodies. It's not entirely clear, it's quite a wordy interpretation about how that's applied. Again, people thought, particularly the smaller organisations and charities who will have less than 10, but aren't clear whether they're a representative body under the existing Act, and we couldn't provide fuller guidance on that. Again, something we could work with to try and do that. In Ireland, they've got a different definition, for example, it could be used. And we talked about multiple returns as well, and I touched on that briefly. We thought that was a good way of perhaps easing some of the burdens in the bureaucracy. We try to do wee things that we can, but the Act itself talks about every instance. It's in the face of the bill, so we can't make a change there. It's down to a committee review type scenario. But we don't see a great difference. If somebody's got a really good purpose and they're doing the same thing with the same person and they're there promoting a campaign or whatever, instead of putting in 50 of the same returns, you could put it in one return. And we'd be happy to look at that as a possibility as well. I think that was...
On those first three, do you have a preferred view, or do you think that's more a policy decision that needs to be made by government? Or, and what's the split there in terms of what can be cleared through guidance and what has to be through legislative reform?
I think all of these things are things that if we had the power, we would have changed them already, but the Section 15 powers only go so far. These relate to the schedule of the Act, and the way the Act is constructed, the Parliament doesn't have the powers to change or modify existing parts of the schedule, so we can't do anything about those. Again, I'm sure we can look at ways in which to improve the guidance as a result of that, but there would be legislative change involved in those.
What do you think that is?
For us, the administrative burden of the constituency exemption has been quite hard. Trying to explain it to people, it's complicated. That would be useful. We could find if you're going to make scope to change there, it could maybe. I think all of it relates to better explanation.
But you don't think there's anything that requires legislative reform in your view?
I'm sorry?
There's not something from within those four parts. There's not something that makes you think this definitely requires legislative reform.
Well, I mean, we work on the Act that's passed, and this is an opportunity to say to the committee and also to reflect stakeholders' views that these are the areas that are causing us a wee bit of difficulty. I mean, if it's possible, we'd like to work to try and remove some of those difficulties. A lot of the evidence you heard related to worries about drudgery and bureaucracy. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to make it. We're trying to work in the least bureaucratic way that we can within the framework that we worked on.
And just finally picking up to what John Mason said, ultimately, you can't tell if there's non-compliance because you're relying on someone voluntarily giving you the information. So if someone chooses not to put a return in, you can't say whether people are being 100% compliant or not. Ultimately, that's left to transparency from the organisations rather than transparency from the body itself. The exact same applies with exemptions, doesn't it? You can't really do compliance on the exemptions. You're relying on individual organisations to tell the truth.
Yes.
Okay. Any other final questions from anybody? No. Billy McLaren, James Drummond, thank you so much for your time this morning and for your evidence, and we look forward to following up with you after the session. I'm now going to suspend briefly as we swap witnesses. Thank you. Good morning, and can I welcome our second panel of witnesses, Graham Day, the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, and Dougie Wan, Senior Policy Advisor, Scottish Government, who are both attending in person, and Al Gibson, Policy Advisor, Parliament and Legislative Unit for the Scottish Government, who is joining us remotely. Can I invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement?
I don't really have anything particular to say, Convener, other than to acknowledge that I very much welcome the work that the committee is doing on this. The bill became an act. The act is there. It's for the Parliament to scrutinise its effectiveness and for this committee to make recommendations. And from the government's perspective, we are simply feeding into that process and assisting you in the important work that you're doing.
Thank you, Mr Day. You'll have seen from our previous evidence sessions that we are looking at this in three themes. The first being around the impact and operation of the Act to date, the second being the status quo or legislative reform, and the third being non-legislative improvement. So that will be broadly the three themes we're following today. I suppose the biggest part for yourself is probably the status quo or legislative reform part, as well as some of the impact and operation, perhaps less low than non-legislative improvements, which is perhaps more a operative question that we covered with the registrar. So we'll try and keep as much focus with those three themes as we can, but there might be a bit of back and forth, given some of the characters on the committee that you know very well, Mr Day. But I'm going to ask Joanne Lamont to kick off on behalf of the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I just have confirmed really from what you've said there, there's no work being done inside the Scottish Government to analyse the effectiveness of this piece of legislation in the context of your commitment to transparency?
The government's commitment to transparency is there. It informs our day-to-day working. This particular act, it has been enforced for 2 years. It's effectively operated by the Parliament. I'll bring Dougie in on detail about anything we may have done, but in principle the answer is no.
Just to confirm what the Minister has said, the Government hasn't engaged in any formal analysis of the impact of the Act over the last 2 years. Obviously the Act gives the powers over the lobbying regime to the Parliament, and I think we would look to the parliamentary authorities to do that.
Just to say, I think that's quite surprising, given that the purpose of the lobbying legislation is to ensure this transparency in the way in which the Scottish Government and people engage with it. Can I maybe ask you about the context then? Because I think the Lobbying Act to me sits with freedom of information and good government to make sure that the way in which decisions are being made is transparent. The influences and things that shape decisions are transparent to people in Scotland. So I want to just check about your own practice. Can I ask, what is the current position around the recording of meetings by Scottish Government ministers and officials? So are all meetings recorded? Are notes taken or minutes taken? Is there some way that we could look to see in what circumstances you would do that? Because obviously, if all meetings are recorded, that makes transparency an awful lot more straightforward for everyone. So on that issue, first of all, what is your practice and what enforcement is there under the Ministerial Code to ensure that practice is followed by all ministers?
Okay, so I have to say at the outset that the Scottish Government provides more detailed information about ministerial activity than any previous administration in Scotland. And I want to get that out there. Guidance for staff is clear about the importance of ensuring an appropriate record of meetings is taken. They're required to keep a record of official meetings that deal with substantive government business and store them in the corporate record, which is ERDM, where they'll be retained in line with the arrangements in our records management plan. For meetings that involve ministers, private offices arrange for a record to be taken of meetings with outside interest groups, including lobbyists, where that has happened, that set out the reasons for the meeting, the names of those attending, and the interests represented. Generally, our policy is not to take minutes of goodwill visits, hospitality events, or courtesy conversations where no policy decisions arise and where it may be sufficient to record within the official diary that the meeting has taken place. And of course, ministers proactively publish their diaries. At an individual level, civil servants are subject to the Civil Service Code of Conduct and accountable for keeping records of decisions and key conversations, and ministers are subject to equivalent rules in the Ministerial Code of Conduct.
So if it were established that a government minister had a meeting to discuss policy, to have somebody who was arguing and debating the policy the government was conducting, if that wasn't either noted or recorded with them, I mean, I know there's a distinction because I have been there, and it was a very rigorous part of my job when I was a minister. That was either there was a note taken which was then circulated, or there was a minute taken which was circulated. Is it an offence under the Ministerial Code or a breach under the Ministerial Code for that not to happen?
Well, we would expect that the guidance that's been issued, obviously, to all civil servants to be followed
No, I'm
in
not,
every
sorry,
case.
I'm not talking about civil servants, I'm talking about ministers. Under the Ministerial Code, if a meeting takes place, which is appropriate and is official, although there's a bit of a bandwidth around what that means, but that a meeting that's going to be discussing policy, if it's not recorded and it's not a note taken, is that a breach under the Ministerial Code?
By rules in the Ministerial Code.
Okay, and there's an equivalent rule under the Civil Service.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, and that would you accept the view that that very rigorous rule actually protects the lobbying legislation because it then makes sure there's going to be a match between the two?
There's an obvious interaction.
Can I ask you, one of the things that the things that came out for me was that working groups, people who were members of working groups, would not come under lobbying. Is that right? They wouldn't come under the lobbying legislation.
You mean organisations?
So the Scottish Government invites people, and again, this is something that goes way back. You want to formulate policy maybe before you get to the point where you're going to have a develop legislation, or there's an area of social policy that you're interested, which might mean at some point you're going to look at funding, and you bring together a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
If there are groups of people on that, if there are people in that group with a very strong view one way or another on particular bits of potential policy, social policy or legislation, there's no need to record that within the lobbying legislation?
Take that, convener. So there is a specific exemption in the schedule to the Act, which regards communications made on request. So where a communication is made in response to a request for factual information or views on that topic from the person who's invited to the person who has asked for that information, then that exemption would apply. So in the circumstances that Joanne Lamont raises, if Scottish Government convenes a working group where a minister may be involved, but organisations have been asked to participate in that working group and to provide factual information and views, then that exemption would certainly apply in those circumstances.
Okay, in that case, I'm interested, genuinely interested in your views in this, because again, I'm very aware this is something that's happened over a long period of time. We establish a working group, but the transparency question is the balance of people within that group in terms of what they're arguing for, and at what point does that trigger over into lobbying? Have you a view on how government could ensure there's a balance of people within that group, or there is transparency about the interest that that group represents? You'll have heard the term policy capture, and it's the idea that people with strong views in a particular policy manage to find themselves in the government machine because they're in a working group or whatever, but that's completely opaque to people looking at it from the outside. So first of all, do you think that's an issue? And secondly, how can that be addressed? Because again, I think this is something that would give us the confidence that the Lobbying Act is doing its job, because other bits of government is affected by it, in a sense, by the very fact of being there.
I see the point that you're getting at. And clearly, and I'm not ducking the issue that this is for the committee to come up with recommendations and a process to follow. But I guess from a ministerial point of view, if you're trying to develop policy, one of the key drivers is to try and avoid unintended consequences. So I would say that instinctively you would want a balance in the makeup of a working group. as a starting point, because you would want to hear the range of views in order to come to an informed policy decision. And certainly speaking personally, that's the approach that I would take. I don't think the problem that you're concerned about exists, but I understand the line of questioning.
How would you monitor whether it exists or not? I mean, in another context, I could probably come and lobby you about the way in which I think that sometimes has happened. But how, as somebody who's responsible for the function of government, how do you ensure that doesn't happen? That you end up in a position, what looks like government policy, in other set of circumstances, it would be clear that there'd been strong lobbying and you've accepted that, but actually because it's folded into a working group and it becomes a recommendation of that working group. How do you monitor that? How do you test that balance is there, that you haven't ended up in a position where policy has come back to you informed by what in other set of circumstances would simply be characterised as lobbying?
But there's a difference, I would argue, between the formulation of policy under a heading and lobbying as such. Lobbying is where, and of course someone is going to articulate their views in the process of a working group, absolutely. But I think there's a nuance here between out and out lobbying, presenting a position, where in a working group you will have a range of views coming across, people will be challenged in that range of views, and I, at the risk of sounding naive, would expect that you would then arrive at a balanced position which will not reflect the ask of everyone who's participated in that. With regard to your point about how do you monitor that, you know, that's something I would take away and think about. But again, there's a subjectivity about that. Some people would look from the outside at the makeup of a working group, and because they have a particular standpoint that they feel has not been sufficiently represented in the working group, I would assert that there is an issue when there may not be.
Would it be helped if there were some, I mean, you can tell me what the transparency is around information that's provided about memberships of individual groups?
I mean, I can't speak across the whole of the Scottish Government, but the establishment of working groups tends to be a public position. Obviously, there are organisations involved in a variety of working groups representing their various sectors, etc. They're obviously free to express their views both within and out with working groups, and particularly when a working group comes to its conclusions and may publish a report or findings and recommendations. Certainly, they would tend to be published by the Scottish Government. At that point, it's not unusual for certain organisations to be able to express a view that dissents from some parts of a working group's output. But yeah, certainly the Government is always keen to ensure that all views from across sectors are represented, particularly for those that are likely to be impacted or have a strong interest in that policy area.
It's just that one of the things that parliamentary committees have been charged with is the importance of not simply talking to the usual suspects. And I just wonder whether there is an issue, I mean, whether this is a bit of work that you would look at, which is, is there disproportionately some groups and organisations overrepresented in these kind of working groups? And is it something that you would look at? Because, I mean, not to labour the point, but it does feel to me that a lobbying act, which is looking at the way in which you influence government, part of that will be effective if there's a stripping or an opening up of the process inside government itself.
So I guess your point is that the loudest voices might be heard most. I think, I mean, talking personally as a minister, I make strenuous efforts to engage with not just the big players in, say, the veteran sector, but all organisations, because inevitably there will be good ideas to be found there. Now, in the context of a working group, a particular issue, there is a limitation to the number of individuals or organisations that can participate. So I recognise the risk that you're portraying, but I think in practice the kind of ministers are looking for the most informed position, so that if we bring forward legislation, say, it's the most robust it can be and the most balanced and avoiding unintended consequences. And you've been in government yourself, and you know that that is the approach that underpins that.
I think the key point, if I'm right, just to make sure we're staying within the scope of what we're supposed to be discussing this morning. I think the point that Joanne Lamont is making around where does that fit around the spirit of transparency and where the Lobbying Act fits in that. I presume that every working group and every sounding board is listed and publicly available in terms of what their membership is. I presume that's the case, because I think the gap that Joanne Lamont perhaps is expressing, and it maybe comes on in terms of the operation of the Act, is if you create a sounding board or you create a working group and it's proactively then created by government or individual MSPs, it negates them and exempts them from the Act. And then whatever conversations take place there, whether it's verbal or face-to-face, again is exempt from the Act, so you wouldn't know what the lobbying was. But I imagine those working groups and their memberships are all publicly available.
I will
simply say in response, Convener, that we can check that. That is my expectation. But I would say that even within the context of a working group formed for a particular purpose, the exemption that I outlined earlier might not apply if an individual representing, their organisation takes the opportunity to raise other matters. So it has to be within essentially the remit of the working group as formed for that exemption to apply. So we can check. My expectation is that working groups, when formed, are publicly announced.
Joanne Lamont.
And one last question, because I think this is also an area that's perhaps, it dovetails with the Lobbying Act as opposed to being about the Lobbying Act itself. Some people have expressed concern that Scottish Government-funded bodies lobby. They both lobby government on policy, but they also lobby the Parliament on MSPs on policy. How can we make that more transparent? If an organisation's funding is more than 70% from the Scottish Government, but it is a separate and independent organisation, do you think there's an issue about those organisations then going and advocating on behalf of Scottish Government policy, which perhaps they've helped develop in the first place?
Well, of course, funding is the detail of funding is publicly available, so it's readily accessible whether there is that interaction with government or not. So I don't see there's a lack of transparency.
Right, so you think it's acceptable for an organisation, a charity, that maybe 70% of its funding is Scottish Government funding, lobbies individuals on behalf of themselves, but in effect what they're doing is lobbying on behalf of the Scottish Government?
Not at all. They may have a policy position that's at odds with the Scottish Government's policy position. They may not agree with the government on something. Sorry?
Would they be allowed to, with their funding?
It's not for the Scottish Government to tell an organisation what its policy position is. An organisation in that situation, its funding, the breakdown of its funding is publicly available, and we've all been aware of instances where the fact that they are an organisation is funded partly, largely by the Scottish Government is brought to the fore if they have a controversial view. So I don't see in that instance there is an issue, because there is no secrecy about the funding that they may largely or in part have.
So there is not, people who receive Scottish Government funding are free to lobby government and be public about doing that, and the amount of funding they have is transparent to the public, so you don't think that's an issue?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Do you think as part of the lobbying return, they should be asked to say if they receive government funding, and if so, what proportion? Or
Well, that's a matter for the committee if they feel that was...
do you have a strong view on it yourself?
No, I don't. I don't have an issue with it if that was something the committee was to come up with, because it's a matter of public record anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, we've taken evidence from a number of witnesses who've raised concerns about the administrative burden arising from the Act on the lobbying organisations. Do you have a view on that?
Well, the Act is the Act. It's been in place for 2 years. Obviously, I'm not somebody who participates in it from that standpoint. There are exemptions for smaller charities, so there is a proportionality about it. But I mean, I think it works pretty effectively. I mean, have you got particular examples of where it would be overly burdensome?
Well, I think some of the organisations were talking about the volume of the returns, the cumbersome manner in which the technology has to be updated and so forth. And, you know, the previous panel, we had a discussion on that, and there were certainly some issues around that. But I suppose what I'm asking is the administrative burden that's been placed in these organisations a price that's worth paying for transparency and accountability?
Well, I think one of the challenges the committee will have is to cut through the kind of, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, kind of approach to contributing to the work you're doing. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but that is inevitable. People will have a view based on they would rather not do that. I think it is a price worth paying for that transparency. Yes, I do. And in reality, I think the bigger question is if we were to add to that burden, there is perhaps a debate to be had around that. But as things stand, I think, from my point of view, it looks the right fit. If there are IT issues, then that's a matter really for the Parliament as an institution to resolve and to work with the organisations concerned to improve things, if there is a legitimate issue there.
Several third sector organisations raised the issue about perhaps redistributing the workload. In other words, pushing some back onto MSPs and ministers, giving them a responsibility to updating the register. How do you feel about that?
But the lobbying register is predicated on those who are doing the lobbying being responsible to register. That's the fundamental of the Act, and that would completely change the balance. I don't see how that's justified. And you know, speaking up for MSPs here, every MSP I know has got a very considerable workload at the moment that has increased immeasurably through the pandemic. And adding to that workload in that administrative way, I don't think it would be welcome or I think justified.
Another thing that's come up is the possibility of MSPs and ministers publishing high-level details of their diaries. And I wondered what your view on that was.
Well, ministerial diaries are published as a matter of course. You know, I sign off, I think, every 3 months, so that takes place. There's a risk, Mr. Beattie, of duplication there. So if we had the lobbying register working as it does, and then MSPs putting that information out there as well, you know, as I say, there's a risk of duplication. If you're suggesting that be replaced, as I say, it fundamentally changes the premise of the responsibility of the Act.
I think people have been pointing to, for example, MEPs who have their own system of automatically uploading their diaries into the public area for transparency purposes. And there seems to be some feeling that we should perhaps be looking at that.
Well, again, and I'm not ducking the question, that's a matter for the committee and the Parliament to consider whether that's justified or not. But, you know, as I say, my diary is out there, and as a minister, we're very clear about who we've interacted with. I would say as an MSP, if I'm speaking purely as an MSP, I am struck that even after 2 years, there are some people don't entirely understand what constitutes lobbying and what doesn't. And you know, I'm sure everyone around the table has had a return and they've thought, was I being lobbied there? Really? Thinking back on what the conversation was. So it's good that people err on the side of caution, but I personally was the subject of a return where I had bumped into a former colleague at a conference, and he represents an organisation that would be deemed as lobbying. But the conversation consisted of, how's work? Oh, it's pretty busy. How are you? I'm pretty busy as well. We then had a chat about our former employment. And a few months later, there was a lobbying return, and for the life of me, looking at it, I'm thinking, I wasn't in any way lobbied, and that tells you that people sometimes misunderstand. But you know what? If we err on the side of caution, that's a good thing.
I think Graham Simpson has a supplementary.
Yeah, actually, I had a very similar situation myself, just bumping into someone at an event, a discussion which was not lobbying, and then, lo and behold, a lobbying return appears, and I actually challenged it, and it got removed because it wasn't lobbying. But I have to be honest, most of the time I don't check. I just wonder, Minister, I mean, you've come here to give evidence. Have you got any thoughts on how you think the Lobbying Act could be improved? Or are you leaving it entirely to us? Have you got your own thoughts?
I think the simple answer to that is I suspect strongly there are small changes that could reasonably be made to improve the working of the Act. I don't think it's for government to push an agenda on this. We are here giving evidence to the committee on the same basis that others have, and you will come to a view. From personal experience, I think there's possibly a bit of work to be done on the speed at which registrations are made, by which I mean, I don't mean how the Parliament processes it, but I've certainly had experience of getting a notification that is considerably late. And you sometimes have to think very carefully about, do I remember having that meeting? Is that accurate? And that's very unusual, but it does happen. So I think there's something there could be done. And I think still after 2 years, making people more aware of what is and isn't lobbying, although in my experience, people have tended to err on the side of caution, which is not a bad thing. So we're not going to sit here today, Mr Simpson, and put forward a range of suggestions, because we would be in that same category I referred to earlier. Well, they might say that, mightn't they? I'm a great believer, as you know, convener, in the parliamentary committees, having been a convener myself, and I think it is for the Parliament, and you, Mr Simpson, it's for the committees of the Parliament to do the job they do, the important job they do, and make recommendations.
Well, I'm sure we'll do that, but I had been hoping you might have some thoughts yourself. So you appear to be agreeing with witnesses who've said that having 6 months to make an entry on the register is too long. You think it should be shorter?
If there is evidence that there's more than the odd instance of that being breached, then clearly that's something that we ought to look at, so that this moves timelessly. In terms of views, there may be certain things that others have suggested that we would have concerns about. But I'm not going to sit here today and say I'm here with a list of things, do's and don'ts. This is for the Parliament. The Parliament owns this Act. It is for the Parliament to come to a view.
Well, I accept that, but normally when a minister comes before a committee that to give evidence, they will have some thoughts, and you don't appear to have any. I've never come across this before.
You're so selfless, Mr. D, in your...
It's quite extraordinary. Well, let me put something let me put one idea that was put to us in the previous session, and that is when we were allowed to have events in the Parliament, people would... There was an issue of, every individual at that event felt they had to make a lobbying return rather than just one, which would cover the whole event.
Yeah.
So the current position is quite bureaucratic and puts people off. Is that something you think could be changed or should be changed?
Personally, yes, I think so. Remember, I'm here speaking for the government, and so it's a slightly different scenario, but I recognise that entirely. We've all been to an event in the Parliament with multiple stalls, and the people who've spoken to us, I can think of a cancer charity I spoke to who had to make individual returns for every single MSP they spoke to on a really important topic. And there is a risk, undoubtedly there's a risk, that if somebody has done that for the first time, they come away with that burden, they may not return. And that's to the detriment of the work of the Parliament. So in an instance like that, I would absolutely agree with you. If you were to recommend a change that allowed an organisation in those specific circumstances to make a generic return, it strikes me as that would be a wise way forward.
Okay, well, there's two things you've agreed with. Can I put something else to you? We explored the issue of planning earlier, and it struck me that the Act currently only covers lobbying to MSPs, MSPs, I think, but doesn't cover councillors. Do you think it should?
Well, of course, well, I mean, the Act relates to this institution, but there is, as you well know, there is a code of conduct for councillors, quite a restrictive code of conduct around planning applications. And therefore, correct me if I'm wrong, I've never been a councillor, but my understanding is that councillors should not be lobbied in that way.
Councillors can be lobbied, but they are not able to express an opinion on the planning application.
And they
can
would
be
have to
lobbied, but there is currently no register of the lobbying that goes on with councillors. So I'm merely asking, do you think there should be?
So, but as I understand it, and I reiterate, I'm not a councillor, they would, if they had such a conversation, they would have to recuse themselves from the eventual decision, wouldn't they?
No, only if you've expressed an opinion publicly.
Most councillors that I know would take a position that they would declare that they had had a conversation. It's an interesting thought. And again, if the committee is minded to put that forward, clearly it would be the subject of consultation.
Thank you, Convener.
No problem. Just 2 points just to pick up from Mr Simpson is one, you agree in principle that the 6 months is perhaps too long, not just in terms of the burden of the submission, but actually also the public interest of it. So something being reported 6 months later might lose its public interest, whereas if it was reported earlier, might still maintain public interest.
If there is evidence that this is an issue, that there is...
So the evidence we heard from our panels kind of almost unanimously agreed that maybe a quarterly was more sensible rather than 6 months. You agree with that?
Well, ministers publish their diaries on a quarterly basis, so yeah, I could see a symmetry there.
Okay, and also I know the bulk uploads of events has been covered off and sorted by the registrar, but you also agree with the principle in bulk uploading?
It seems eminently sensible to avoid the risk of groups not coming back to engage with us as MSPs and adding to our knowledge and understanding, yes.
Okay. John Mason.
Button by mistake, sorry. Thanks, Convener. Yes, I mean, I take the point, Minister, that you don't have strong views on a lot of this, but I'll try a few other things as well. I mean, the suggestion that local government might be included, I mean, another suggestion has been that more of a range of civil servants could be included, because they obviously then influence ministers. Now, you can maybe just confirm, I mean, this Act is not aimed at the government. This Act is aimed at the whole Parliament. But do you have any thoughts about whether we should be expanding it, or is that something you don't have strong views on?
I do have a strong view on that. I guess that puts me in that category of they would say that, wouldn't they? I think there is a very great risk of extending this to senior civil servants, that we encroach on a very important aspect of the work of the government, and that is policy development. So the suggestion that we extend that to include all senior civil servants, I think runs the risk of stakeholders perhaps feeling inhibited in participating in developing policy. I think it's important to recognise that civil servants and ministers occupy a different space civil servants, although they have a clear link to ministers, occupy a different space from politicians. The day-to-day operation of government involves interaction between civil servants and organisations. And I think if we were to move into that space, it would also be incredibly burdensome from an administration point of view. So I would have real concerns about that on both fronts.
I mean, you used the word burdensome there, and that theme has come up, I think, already, because another suggestion has been that we move into like emails and phone calls, which clearly there is a huge volume of, as well as face-to-face meetings. I mean, again, do you have thoughts about expanding it, things in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I understand entirely the concerns that have been raised about that extension. I mean, there's been 12,000 instances of regulated lobbying that have been published already, which I think, as I understand it, is well in excess of what was anticipated at the time the Act was introduced. I think if you get into that territory, I think it was RNIB said that the administrative burden would increase to such an extent it would be a deterrent for organisations like them communicating with decision makers. It would also go against the original intentions of the Act. So I think we've got it right, where it's face-to-face interaction, whether that be physical face-to-face interaction or more likely these days video conferencing.
Yes. I mean, there's a balance. I mean, I totally accept the volume, and I don't want to spend a whole lot more money employing people or IT or whatever for these purposes. On the other hand, the public, if we said to them, you know, what is lobbying and what should be recorded and what would not, I think they might be surprised if they realised that we get a lot of emails, we get glossy magazines, I get a little metal turbine from one company recently. We get taken out for dinners. I know hospitality has to be recorded at a certain level. But there's a lot of things that I think the public in their mind would think of as this is lobbying, and it's just not there.
But we are sat in this room as MSPs, and we recognise the practical implications of doing that, the sheer volumes that would be involved. And I think on that basis, if no other, it's not somewhere we should go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and my final point, Convener, if I may. I mean, cost has been suggested that other countries, other parliaments do bring cost into it. So the fact that, you know, a big company is paying quite a lot of money for somebody to come and do the lobbying is a little bit different from, you know, a little charity that, yes, they've got 10 employees and yes, they count, but it's at a much, you know, kind of lower key level. They're not spending so much on it. Again, would that be worth looking at?
Oh, again, that's a matter for the committee, but it's the act of lobbying, not who does it, that's relevant here, isn't it?
Do you think people with money behind them kind of more influence than people without money?
It's an argument, but the premise of the Act is the act of lobbying. Mm-hmm. Again, that's something you've taken evidence from multitude of sources. Can I bring Dougie in and comparators with other countries? Because obviously that's something that was looked at the time the Act was introduced.
Thank you, Minister. I think maybe something that my colleague Al Gibson, who was involved in the earlier sort of policy development stages, can add some value on. But the premise of our Act in Scotland is very much about the individual instances of lobbying, regardless of who carries that out, as long as an exemption doesn't apply. We recognise that you know, some financial details are not included in, for example, the UK Register of Consultant Lobbyists, which is very much aimed at those professional organisations that, for a fee, will promote particular policy positions to UK ministers. In that register, then they need to publish their client lists, but the individual instances of lobbying that you see in the Scottish Register are not disclosed. But I wonder if Al has anything further he would want to add.
Al Gibson is joining us remotely. You're on mute, Mr. Gibson. No, we can't hear you, so we'll perhaps come back to you, Mr. Gibson, when we can restore a connection. I see that Joanne Lamont had a brief supplementary, and then I'm going to go to Alec Neil. Yeah,
I just wanted to reflect on what you've just said about civil servants. I appreciate civil servants have a different role from ministers. But for what you've argued, it would be possible for a minister to call or receive a call from someone who's lobbying you, have a conversation, say, look, what you need to do, meet with my senior civil servant in this area, and that would have no visibility whatsoever. That wouldn't be recorded anywhere. And then you're saying you wouldn't want that to be transparent because it might inhibit participation. Is that not the very point about the issue of transparency, that people are happy to lobby and put pressure on government as long as they're not accountable for doing it and not seen to be doing it? Do you accept that there's a deficit in the model that you've just presented, and that it would be entirely reasonable not to name the civil servant, but for meetings between stakeholders and the civil servant role to be logged somewhere?
You pretend a particular scenario that I don't overly recognise, that a minister is called and they direct them to civil service. If that happened, then I'm not understanding entirely where you're coming from on that.
So what I'm suggesting to you is, you speak to anybody out there in our communities who's trying to influence stuff, it might be, organisations, might be businesses, they say, well, I've got this issue, and quite often, and quite reasonably, because you can't possibly expect government ministers to be at every meeting, they will be given the opportunity to meet with officials. So the government has sanctioned, the government minister said, yes, meet with my officials. This has happened to me, it's happened to other people. Meet with my officials and discuss that question. You're saying that because they meet with a civil servant, that is not to be logged anywhere. That's the first thing. But your argument for it was because it might inhibit participation. Well, first of all, why would it inhibit participation? And secondly, is that not the whole point of the Lobbying Act, is to open up and let people see what are the influences on government and how people lobby? And if they're inhibited from being seen to do that, then that might suggest there is a problem.
I think we're talking about, and perhaps I haven't explained that particularly well, or I've allowed that confusion. The point I'm making is, if we get into the territory that every interaction with senior civil servants, and it would be every interaction, you've come up with a specific example.
It would be a meeting.
But if so, any interaction with senior civil servants were to be recorded, it would potentially have the impact of inhibiting, particularly in that space of day-to-day engagement and policy development, as an example, it would have that effect. And that's just the practical.
Well, first of all, you've said that these are all recorded anyway, so it wouldn't be a massive leap to make sure that that was in a record that was public. But second, I'm not talking about day-to-day contact. I'm talking about meetings where people are arguing a case because they want to influence what the government is doing. And it's, of course, a common vehicle for ministers to have the civil servant. We've all heard it. I secured a meeting with the officials. I can't make it, but you can meet with my officials to talk about this. Are you seriously saying, A, that can't be recorded because the role of civil servant is different? I don't accept that. Or that somehow that would inhibit participation. To me, that gets to the very heart of this. If somebody's inhibited from speaking to a government minister and official by the fact that somebody else will know about it, it's precisely what has driven the Lobbying Act in the first place.
With respect, I think you're confusing two things, but to answer your question, can it be recorded? Yes, it can be recorded. It could be recorded if that's what you're driving at. And that's a matter for the committee to consider whether it wants to specifically focus on that. I'm simply outlining the general situation regarding interaction.
But you think still that you wouldn't want the change because it would inhibit, as you said, stakeholders from participating?
I think there are consequences that would flow from it that might not be entirely to the benefit of the whole process.
So are there any circumstances you can think of in your own job where my knowing that you had that meeting would create a problem? And by my knowing, in the sense of public knowing that you were having that meeting, or your civil servant was having that meeting on your behalf, would in any way inhibit the process?
But the point, as a minister, any meeting I have is recorded as a matter of course and released. I think that the point here about any meeting, because unless you had a very specific surgical approach to that scenario that you have pointed out, Ms Lamont, it would capture all sorts of things which would, I think, be unadvisable.
So perhaps what we need to have is absolute confidence in the first question I asked you about the rigour in which all meetings with ministers and senior civil servants are recorded and noted, so that if at some point I want to go to Freedom of Information and get that information, I can access it, rather than what we've had within the lifetime of this Parliament, people being told, well, we can't tell you if that meeting took place because or what happened to that meeting because no note was taken of it. You know that has been a feature of some political discourse over the last period.
Yeah, I recognise the point you're making, but
Okay.
I don't necessarily agree with you on it.
Alec Neil.
Alex and Al, can I just test you?
Oh, have we lost Mr Neil? While we get Alec Neil back, can I just press you on a couple of things, Minister, that both John Mason and Joanne Lamont covered? Isn't it the fact that through this Lobbying Act we've said that the most effective form of lobbying is face-to-face, and therefore we record face-to-face meetings? But you can form a relationship in a face-to-face meeting and then do the really hard lobbying by phone call or by email. Do you not accept that is a glaring gap in the transparency of lobbying?
In general?
Yes.
No, I don't. I see the argument you make. I get that. But I come back to the burden of recording all of that, the sheer volumes for anyone as an MSP, an active MSP, someone who is maybe sits on a couple of committees in the Parliament as well, the sheer volume that would arise from that for their staff, for example. Would we have allowances having to be enhanced to have more staff? Somebody whose actual job was just to do that.
Have you ever been lobbied by phone?
By phone?
Yeah.
As an MSP?
As an MSP and or as a minister?
I'm struggling to think of many, if any, examples. You always have conversations with people on the telephone. Whether it would constitute lobbying is another matter.
As far as you're concerned, you don't think you've ever been lobbied by phone?
I don't see it as a significant issue. I mean, right
It's
now...
a pretty straightforward question. Yeah. Do you ever think you've been lobbied by phone?
I'm not thinking of too many examples of that off the top of my head, is the honest answer.
But off the top of your head, you've never been lobbied on the phone?
There would be instances where you could perhaps, as an MSP, say someone has had a conversation. Yes, of course that there would be.
And
does the volume of that justify the consequences of bringing that into the kind of scope?
Do you think
of the
any of your
Act?
ministerial colleagues or cabinet secretaries or the First Minister has been lobbied by phone?
I don't know. You would have to ask them.
But what do you think? You must have a view. What do you think?
I find it difficult to answer other than for myself.
Okay. And do you think civil servants have been lobbied by phone?
Lobbied.
Yes.
Inevitably, any conversation, or the volumes of conversation, if people are developing policy, there will be a range of views expressed to them in conversations. But if we go back to this point, Mr Sarwar, are we saying that every phone call and every email would be captured by this? I mean, for example, resource.
But I suppose the fundamental question, though, Mr Day, comes from, if we accept, it's basically about whether we accept that the Lobbying Act in its current form is window dressing or is actually going to get to the crux of lobbying. If we accept it's window dressing, then okay, let's just cover what it covers, let it do what it does, and we'll all just get along with it, and nothing will ever, it won't really ultimately change people's behaviour or give us greater transparency, unless you think it has changed people's behaviour and it has given us greater transparency, and you can answer that question in a moment. Or whether it's about giving us genuine openness and transparency, and if it does it achieve it, and if not, what the gaps? Because are you honestly saying you've never had a telephone conversation and it's maybe informed your opinion or changed your mind on something?
It would inform your thinking, yes. Can I go back to the point that you made there? When the Act originally came forward, there were a number of overarching principles, and one of them was the need to deliver improved transparency through a proportionate solution. And I think that's what we have achieved. Now, it may be that there is an argument or a need to extend that further, but I go back to the point about, has it improved transparency? Well, clearly, we have 12,000 records that suggest it has. Has that informed behaviours? I think inevitably it will have done to a greater or lesser extent. And then there is the proportionality about the approach. And also, I guess, through the work that the committee has done, what evidence has emerged of a problem or the scale of a problem, which then informs your thinking about what the response to that should be.
Have you ever said to someone, okay, I think you should speak to X civil servant about this?
Yeah, there would be an occasion where I would say, I think you need to speak to officials about that, but stopping the conversation, not have the conversation and direct them. I would tend to say, I think you should speak to officials, or I will, you know. Okay,
and then so in terms of our work, in terms of what we do from our report, do you think emails should be included in the Lobbying Act, yes or no?
No, not least of all.
Do you think phone calls should be included in the Lobbying Act, yes or no?
No.
Do you think civil servants should be included in the Lobbying Act, yes or no?
Senior civil servants, no.
Okay. Do you think any civil servant should be included?
Well, I think
in
what was talked about, sorry,
yes
to be clear, what was being talked about was senior civil servants. That was the reference in my answer to you. No, I don't.
Okay.
For all of the reasons I've articulated.
Okay. Excellent. So it seems that you don't think you should have an opinion because it's for the Parliament to decide on the easy bits, but on the hard bits you do have an opinion. You don't think we should make any substantive change.
No, I was asked if I had any ideas to put forward about changing the Act. I did say at the time when I answered that there may be things that I don't agree with that you may put to me, and I've just demonstrated that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Day. We now have Alec Neil back. I'm going to go to Alec Neil.
Hey, thank you, Convener. Just picking up from where you left off there, can I ask the Minister if he has any specific thoughts or ideas or proposals on any reforms, not necessarily legislative reforms, it could be process reforms that don't require legislation, but has he any specific areas where he thinks the operation and scope and implementation of the legislation could be improved?
Well, I think Mr Neil gave a couple of small examples earlier on, but I guess in terms of how the Act operate, that is more going to come from the practitioners and from the parliamentary authorities who are implementing the Act. They're the ones that are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of taking account of views, if I was doing the job that you're doing, I think those are the influences that I would most listen to if there are good, solid ideas coming forward from those sources. But as I said earlier, there is perhaps an argument for going to quarterly reporting, and there's perhaps an argument for it's even now increasing understanding of what is and isn't captured by the Act.
So would it be true to say from a government point of view as opposed from a parliamentary point of view, generally speaking, there are no major issues of principle that the government has with the implementation and the operation of the Act?
No.
Right. Okay. We've had a debate about civil servants and the scope of the Act, and please don't interpret my questions as advocating anything. I'm merely trying to get to an understanding of the government's position. Clearly, the whole point of the Act was to make more transparent the process and the influences on public policy making, to make sure that people are aware of the potential influence of lobbying and what impact that has on policy as part of the wider open and reinforcing the underlying principles of the Parliament, the founding principles of openness, transparency and accountability. So can I ask about three categories of people who do influence policy, which we haven't mentioned so far? The first one are SPADs, Special Advisors to Ministers. These are appointed collectively by ministers, report directly to ministers, work under ministers, and are very clearly involved and are the recipients of lobbying. There is no doubt about that. I know that from my own ministerial experience, as well as being in this Parliament for almost 22 years. So there's no dispute in my mind anyway that SPADs, ever since the Parliament has been created under successive administrations, SPADs have been a route for lobbyists to influence ministers, and sometimes, and I've done it myself, I have asked SPADs for time pressures, if for nothing else, to meet particular groups to hear their point of view, because I just didn't have the time to see them all myself. And in that process, SPADs were effectively lobbied, albeit as representatives, as it were, of ministers. So, and unlike civil servants, they have, although technically they are employed by the civil service, they are not civil servants in the traditional sense, and they're not senior civil servants in that sense. So do you think that it would be appropriate to consider extending the scope of the Act to cover SPADs? Is my first question. I'll let you answer that before I go into the other two.
Okay. The role of SPADs in this, is it particularly different to the role of civil servants in the context of engagement with groups through working groups or policy development? It's all part of the same process. And as I go back to the point, it's a matter for the committee if it wants to make particular recommendations.
It's just to clarify for the committee that special advisers are currently covered by the terms of the Act in Section 1. So the Act presently covers obviously all MSPs, all ministers, and also a special adviser or the permanent secretary. So special advisers and the permanent secretary are presently caught by the Act.
Right, by special advisers, I mean, we've just heard from Al, we're going to hear from Al, no doubt, again. So the terminology of special advisers, is that only the special advisers appointed, if you like, temporarily by ministers, or does it include people who are called special advisers who are non-political appointments?
I'm going to come to Mr Day in a second. Just to clarify, Mr Neil, the committee won't have heard what Al said. You'll have heard him because you're on the broadcasting with him on the Blue Jeans app, but we unfortunately didn't hear what he said, so we may well get him back. But Mr Day, you want to respond to Mr Neil's?
The individual that Mr Neil has referred to as a civil servant.
So that's my point. When, in terms of the government's view, and as it applies to SPADs, the term SPADs is usually used for the small group of, if you like, political SPADs, if I can put it that way. But for non-political advisors who are part of the civil service, does it or doesn't it apply to them in your views? What's your interpretation? And I think it's the other chap who has to answer that, because presumably he's the lawyer.
Dougie Wands.
Mr Neil, I'm pleased to put on the record that I'm not a lawyer, but very clear that the Act covers the political special advisers appointed by ministers, and of course you will be able to see that list within the register, but it is updated as and when those political appointed advisers change.
Right. So it doesn't cover non-political advisors, is that right, Dougie?
I'm not entirely clear what sort of category of officials you're referring to, Mr Neil, but the present Act only covers the small group of political appointed advisers, as I've explained.
So my question is, should other advisors be included? Because by definition, the terminology is of advisor. If you're an advisor, you are advising on policy. So if you're advising on policy and you're the subject of lobbying, my question is, should these people be included in the scope of the legislation?
Mr Day, I'll ask you to respond to that, and then I think Al Gibson wants to come in as well. But if you can respond to that first, please, and then I'll go to Al Gibson.
But I think, Mr Neil, you're confusing two things. You could argue, as I think you almost are, that any civil servant who is offering advice to ministers on policy development for something should be captured that. Then we go way beyond what has been suggested previously about senior civil servants being captured by this, and then you get in a whole different tier and define someone who's offering advice to ministers. Ministers will be advised, in inverted commas, by a multitude of officials, as you well know.
So the short answer, Mr Day, is you don't think they should be included?
No, absolutely
Okay.
not.
Al Gibson.
Hello, hopefully everybody can hear me. Apologies for the difficulties. I just for the record, I see that I'm labelled a policy advisor, and I believe that's what Mr. Neil is alluding to. And if the understanding is that myself as a civil servant should be covered, I think the minister's just covered that. But again, I would say that I've been interested by the exchanges, and I think that obviously the committee is used to government bills coming forward and the government taking policy positions, but just if it helps the committee just to clarify that this bill has always at the time been seen as in a group of its own. It was a government bill, that's beyond doubt, but it was brought forward and sponsored by the government on the basis of ensuring that there was a means by way to secure a consensual approach, and the Parliament did agree to the approach at the time. Now we are at the point of review. The position is, as the Minister is saying, it is for the committee to take a view and for the Parliament to take a view. So there will be issues on which the government may have a view, but incidentally, it is obviously covering ministers. So that causes difficulty. So all I would say is that it is possible for the Act to do whatever the committee or the Parliament indeed decides it should do. And I was interested to hear the views from the Registrar and the earlier evidence and members' concerns about enforcement and scope. And that's the very thing. I mean, as we deal in facts in the civil service, and if there is a belief that there is a need for it, then the committee and the Parliament may indeed go down that way. But there is a clear impact in terms of what that might mean. And again, if it's helpful to the committee, during my time involved in developing the bill, we did dwell very purposely on the point of proportionality and also facts about what the environment in Scotland was actually requiring. So, sorry when I was cut off, but yes, we did look at different scenarios, and members will probably be aware. I mean, you can pay your money and take your choice. I mean, there's the American model, which I think is known to be the most rigorous. But again, if it's helpful, we looked at the Scottish circumstance and what was the proportionate for our circumstance. So we accepted all the views from the range of stakeholders, and I met with many people during that time. And again, everybody had their point of view, but it's basically what is deemed to be required.
Could I ask,
Alec Neil, back to Alec Neil.
As a matter of interest, sorry, could I ask, just as a matter of interest, Mr. Gibson, as a policy advisor, so-called, have you ever been lobbied?
Well, I've been involved in policy in and out throughout my career. I mean, I suppose I have, but that is part of the.
In your current role, then, you have been lobbied?
Well, again, I mean, these are very sweeping. I don't mean to be unhelpful, but yes, I suppose, of course, I was. I mean, during the course.
The question's fairly straightforward. Within the terms of the legislation as it stands, in terms of the definitions you would accept it of lobbying, have you been lobbied in your current position?
No, if anybody was speaking to me, I mean, again, I don't mean to be difficult here, but, I'm not caught by the scope of the Act as it currently is drafted, so that would not constitute regulated lobbying. But I think in my professional experience, as I mentioned, involved in the original bill, quite obviously, whether it was whatever range of stakeholder was coming to state their position, they would have arguably been certainly states lobbying me just to say, this is our point of view. And I think it goes back to this position that was mentioned earlier about the working groups. I mean, that is the nature of government. We as officials and our ministers are, it's the natural course of events to take a range of views on board.
Mr. D wants to come back in.
Okay,
Sorry, Mr. Neil, if you give us two... Sorry, Mr. Neil, I'm going to get Mr. Day to respond and then I'm going to come to you for your final question.
It just struck me, listening to that, something came to mind. If you were to go down this road, would committees of the Parliament be captured by that? Because you issue a call for evidence, so on one level you invite comment, but then everybody who wrote to the committee, everyone who sent an email, and I'm not trying to muddy the waters, I'm just thinking through the consequences of this. So would the Parliament's committees and the work they do in formulating an approach, taking evidence on a bill, whatever, would that be captured by such an extension? These are the kind of things that
I accept that question, but I would say that I think we probably proactively publish a lot more than the government does in terms of committees, and perhaps government should follow that same model from committees in terms of proactive publishing. Alec Neil.
Well, the other thing is committees do the vast bulk of their work openly in open session, which obviously, quite rightly, a lot of government stuff is not done that way. My final question to the Minister is, and it's in the same theme, and again, I emphasise, I am not advocating anything, because I, as other committee members will confirm, I am a sceptic in terms of some of this legislation. But the other area are government agencies such as Scottish Enterprise and SEPA, which make policy within legislative framework, but they do have policies by definition. So, and clearly they are lobbied from time to time. So do you think that quangos like Scottish Enterprise and SEPA should be considered for inclusion in the scope of the Act?
Minister.
That's a matter for the committee to recommend. I keep going back to this.
Do you have a view? You have a view in civil servants, you have a view in ministers, do you have a view in quangos?
I can see the argument that Mr Neil is advancing, even though he says he's not making that argument. But again, the likes of SEPA will interact with stakeholders on a range of things in formulating a policy approach. So do we get down to that level of what is listening to a range of views, coming to an informed position? If you take, for example, SEPA's reputation in the farming community is greatly enhanced now compared to what it was years ago, because they engaged, they listened, they worked with the farming community, and they came up with what they would consider a more proportionate approach. Now, is that lobbying, or is that a wise approach to developing policy? And if the committee feels that it should be captured by the Act, then that's clearly something to be looked at.
Mr Neil?
And I think the issue is a goose and gander here, because, you know, to be honest, I think on the whole, backbench MSPs have far less influence in policy than the likes of special advisors, or advisors, if I could call them that, or government agencies. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I think the problem here is, if you think that lobbying legislation is required, it then becomes difficult to, I think, argue that people who are heavy influencers on policy, such as advisors, such as quangos, and these are people and organisations that are lobbied, why would they be excluded when MSPs who have very often less influence directly on policy are included? And I think that's a contradiction in the legislation that needs to be resolved.
But there's also, I guess, a contradiction in where we are right now at this moment. You say that backbench MSPs have little influence. This committee of backbench MSPs will have a far greater influence on how we look to develop, if that's what happens, the Lobbying Act. You, as backbench MSPs, have listened to a range of views. You could argue you've been lobbied. You will produce a report. That report could become the subject of a consultation. People will feed in views. So I'm not sure that I entirely accept, I understand where you're coming from, Mr Neil, that backbench MSPs are deprived of that opportunity, and the proof is here today.
Joanne Lamont. No, sorry, Mr Neil, you want to ask, sorry.
Can I just correct that, convener? Because that was not my point. I'm saying across the piece, backbench MSPs, I agree on this subject that this committee hopefully will have influence, but across the piece very often policymakers in other parts of public administration, such as Quangos, have on a day-to-day basis as much influence, if not more influence, in certain aspects of policy. And therefore, if the purpose of the Act, sure that policymakers who are lobbied, and that becomes transparent. If that's the purpose of the Act, to make sure that lobbying of policymakers is true, then MSPs are by far not the only and sometimes not the most important policymakers in public administration.
I think the point Alec Neil is making is good attempt to divert, Minister, but try again.
No, I'm not trying to divert at all. I mean, but this idea that backbench MSPs are impotent set against SPADs or policy advisors or whatever, I just don't recognise that. If you look at the parliamentary process, and I've been a convener and a backbencher, the government will bring forward an informed policy position that has taken a range of views. The committees will scrutinise that. They will take evidence. You will make recommendations. And as you well know, Mr Sarwar, very often quite a lot of what's in committee reports is actually taken on board by government. And then the MSPs vote, and we are in a parliament that...
I think you're diverting again, Mr D, but I'll hand over to Joanne Lamont.
We've got an array of straw men getting thrown up there, I think, to be honest. On this question, first of all, for example, if the Parliamentary Committee, and is as transparent as conclusions, presents that to the Scottish Government, the point is we won't know who will have influenced your attitude to those recommendations. We won't know who has lobbied you, or your civil servants say, well, no, we can't possibly have that because that's not any good. So it's not, there's no equivalence there. But I also wondered, you simply do not accept Quangos, these bodies, public bodies, they play a really important role in communities like you talked about, SEPA, education, there's a whole array of them who will be making decisions which will influence the government's view, and we've seen this now in some very bad decisions in some cases, but what is not transparent is what influenced their decisions. So perhaps some bodies in the farming communities think SEPA is doing a great job because finally they've agreed with them, but we haven't seen why they've come to that conclusion. I mean, you would accept that these public bodies play a huge role in influencing what's going on in their communities, and it would be hard for me, I'd be interested in what the argument is, that they ought not, that there should be no transparency in what helps them come to that conclusion.
I didn't argue against it. I think, to be clear, I think I said I recognise the point that's being made. I think there is a validity about that argument. It's up to the committee whether it brings it forward. But can I just correct something, Ms Lamont? You've inferred there that a parliamentary committee would bring forward recommendations in a report, and perhaps I'm picking you up the wrong way. Then you're suggesting that somebody, organisations, could lobby the government against accepting the recommendations of the committee. That's not how it works in practice at all.
So what is an informed policy view then? You said that you would come back to recommendations of a parliamentary committee with an informed view on those recommendations. What would your definition then be of being informed, and would it categorically exclude people external to the actually ministers informing or helping you shape your thinking? Because
the policy position...
Clearly, I mean, to be obvious, to be clear about this, if a parliamentary committee takes a view, particularly in a policy area, the government then has to decide in its response what its informed view is. There will be people who will be unhappy with those recommendations if it's in a policy area. It would be possible for your view to be informed by their lobbying of you, if that's what an informed policy view is, but the point is we wouldn't know. There would be no transparency around how your informed policy review in your attitude to the parliamentary committee's report was formed.
I think you're misunderstanding the process. Let me be clear. A committee would produce a report with recommendations. The government would reflect on those recommendations. Now, the government would perhaps consider some of them are not wise based on its viewpoint, which has been formed. The government would also take account of the fact that it requires to engage with a committee with individual MSPs. The Parliament will then have a discussion about these. The idea that somehow, in my experience, that somehow there's then a kind of further stage where the Parliament's made recommendations to its committees and then the government is lobbied by people. Of course, in the same way, we've all seen in the run-up to an amendment stage of a bill, as MSPs, we are inundated with people telling us what we ought to do. You'll get a list of, you know, you should vote for this, you should vote against that.
Precisely.
That's in the nature of it.
That's precisely the point I'm making, that the government's informed view on whether they will accept or resist those amendments, as an example, or will accept or resist recommendations. That informed view is not simply internal to government. And therefore, it may be a Quangos say, wait a minute, you can't do that because there's going to be this consequence, or it may be a group that has lobbied you. And the point is that that will not be transparent. And indeed, in some circumstances, and to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, that conversation about why that recommendation should be resisted will not even be, it will not even be evident that that conversation took place.
But I guess in the context of the, and I don't accept all that, but in the context of the process of amendment, etc., there is another element, and this is not a deflection, but there will be situations in which MSPs bring amendments to the process that were not dreamt up by the MSPs. They are amendments that have been given to them by organisations, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a lack of transparency about that.
My recollection is, certainly in private members' bills, you have to say if you have been supported by anybody. And it would be very unusual not to, for that to be clear. But the point I'm making is round, you have said the protection round is this parliamentary committee, like others, can make recommendations and the government will come back with an informed view. I'm
sorry,
you,
a view that has seen them reflect upon the recommendations of the committee report, and it will respond accordingly.
Right, so if a stage 1 report from a committee says something very challenging to a particular interest, whether it's a farming community or a housing organisation or whatever, or say from one area, say it said something very challenging about the cooperative sector, and you came back and I said to you, you can't let that happen as a representative of the cooperative sector, that is really damaging. That lobbying will not necessarily be transparent. If a farming group comes to you and says, you can't support that stage 1 recommendation, what we're looking for, I guess, is transparency around how you came to that informed policy view on a stage 1 report or a recommendation to a parliamentary committee.
Today, and then Mr Bowman has been very patient.
Yes, he
We'll
has.
come to Mr Bowman in a moment.
I just think there's a misunderstanding of the process here about how we get to that point. The government will have its view will be reflected in the original bill, the view that it's arrived at. There may be things that come up in the evidence sessions of the committee which will influence its thinking. There may be clear reason why the committee has made the recommendations, and the government will accept those. It's part of, I think it is a pretty open...
With respect, you've simply said that you have not, it's for this committee to make recommendations, and you don't have a view. But you will have a view if we're going to say something that you don't agree with, and therefore, but we wouldn't know how you came to that view. That's, anyway.
Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. More simple aspect. I think, Mr Day, you said earlier that the government had no issues with the implementation or operation of the Act. And in an earlier session, we heard that there was an 11% deletion rate of returns that come in. So, I mean, could the government be doing more about educating, if that's the right word, the public and informing them about the Act as it is before we get into any changes? And as we can hear from the discussions this morning, there are many areas that people want clarification on as it stands, never mind an enhanced Act.
I go back to what I said earlier about the Act is administered by the Parliament. But clearly, if the Parliament were to suggest to us that there was an issue about, and I think I touched on it myself, about lack of understanding still after 2 years of what is and isn't covered, then that's clearly something to be looked at, but it will come out through this process. The committee may well recommend that there is an issue there that needs to be addressed. And I recognise the issue, the point you make. There will be operational aspects of this that we are not readily cited on as a government, there are valid concerns around it, and that would be one at an 11% rate.
So is there no sort of ongoing interaction between the Commissioner and the Scottish Government on how the things are going and issues that come up, and perhaps things like deletion rates?
Well, I'll bring Doug in, but I would just to remind you, there was a government amendment brought to the Act to get us to this point where after 2 years there would be a review. Mm-hmm. So that was always the plan, to see how it operated, and then for the Parliament to review it. Okay.
Just to respond to Mr Bowman's question, the Act very clearly is for the Parliament to has been from the Parliament to implement from when the Act came into force, and it's done day to day through the Registrar's office, and you've just heard from the Registrar and the Deputy Registrar. So we do not engage regularly with them in terms of the operation of the administration of the Act. That's very much a matter for them. We do interact where there are needs to share information, for example, about changes in ministerial office holders and so forth. But beyond that, we are not regularly engaged on matters to do with the implementation. So, I mean, I think to address the points, the concerns that the committee has heard, and some captured also in the Registrar's annual reports, I think this is the opportunity. This review after 2 years of operation, it was always intended that there would be an opportunity to review in light of experience, and the experience seems to be that in some cases there are certain elements of the Act still causing confusion. The Registrar team have done a lot, I think, in terms of producing very valuable guidance, but if some of those issues of interpretation remain very difficult, I think the committee may well make some recommendations for adjustment there.
Thank you. I'm sure we will. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, Minister, but there are a few questions, just really brief ones, just for completion in terms of some of the issues that have been raised, and we want to obviously come back on in terms of our report. Do you think the current legal framework is sufficiently robust in terms of looking at non-compliance with the Act?
In the absence of evidence to the contrary, I would have to say yes. But evidence may come forward from this process that indicates otherwise. Okay.
And do you think there's enough scope in the current legal framework to bring to light any undue influence or improper lobbying practices?
Again, I would have to say the same thing. I'm not aware of anything, but again...
So you think it doesn't exist, or we just don't have sufficient ways of finding it, if it does exist?
In all of these processes, what reason is there to believe there isn't? Is there evidence of that, and we should look at it?
Okay, but so you don't think any exists?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay. And there were some specific examples, probably 3 that require legislative, minor legislative changes that came from the Registrar in the earlier evidence. You might not have seen that, obviously, no, Minister, because you were waiting to come in. But I presume you'll look at those, and if you could come back to a response to those very specific ones that were raised by the Registrar, that would be very helpful.
Well, we can easily do that, but our engagement with this process is actually to hear what the committee is going to recommend or respond to that. But if you would like us to have a look at that...
If you have a look at it, in case you have a view on those...
So we will write to you.
If you have a view, then please do share that with us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the final question was around whether the actual Act itself, in terms of how it operates, the Registrar, etc., is that now, cost of that still being subsidised by the Scottish Government, or is that now all consumed by the Scottish Parliament's own budget?
So the process is that the Parliament comes to the Government with a budgetary ask. That is overseen by the Finance Committee. To the best of my knowledge, and Dougie will tell me if I'm wrong, that has never been in any way rejected by the Government. Contained within that is an ask relating to the Act. If the Parliament came with an enhanced ask, justified through that process, then the Government would fund that. So there is no impediment to it.
Okay. Thank you. Any final questions from committee members or any final comments from the Minister? No, with that, can I thank Mr Day, Dougie Wands and Al Gibson, who's joining us remotely, for the evidence this morning, and I now close the public part of this meeting as we move into private session.